Well, let's jump in here to chapter 13. I mean, this is one of those chapters where there are some obvious things. And of course, sprinkled in there is going to be some not so obvious things. And, we're going to stick to our, trajectory, Old Testament backdrop for this sort of stuff. So there, I can sort of telegraph where we're going to go here. But as far as the beasts go, there's two of them, in this chapter. There's plenty of Old Testament antecedent material that could factor into that. When it comes to the number, not so much. When we get to that point, I will mention a few sort of, I'll call them trajectories, but they're really just speculative. Even though I think more highly of one than the other. At the end of the day, they're both still speculative as far as an Old Testament connection or context. So as we jump into this, I'm gonna just read through the chapter real quickly. It's not that long, and then we'll start off with the two beasts. So reading ESV again, verse 1. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb, who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Verse 11. And I saw another beast rising out of the earth. First one was the sea, this one's the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. And also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that none can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, again, since we're focusing on Old Testament stuff, we're not going to, get into too many interpretive things here. But there are, again, some fruitful trajectories as far as how to contextualize the content here. The most obvious, is having to do with the beast. There are really 2 options here. Again, 2 interpretive trajectories that are possible with respect to contextualizing the beasts, both of them, with the Old Testament. Now, one of these is going to be pretty obvious. The other one is probably not going to be obvious. And so I'm going to go through both of these. I don't really feel compelled to only go with one, the more obvious one. I think that there's actually both in play, because the more obvious of the 2 is, of course, what's going on in Daniel 7, with the sort of nondescript, final beast and whatnot, so on and so forth. But there are disconnections from that. For instance, in Revelation 13, as we read, there's not just one beast, there's 2, and one is from the sea and the other one's from the land. And there is, again, some Old Testament precedent for two beasts, sea and land, that would have importance here, or relevance is probably a better word, especially if we look at what's going on in Revelation 13 as sort of Babel chaos, not reborn, because we've always got Babel chaos. Okay, again, chaos, when I use that term, I mean everything that is not Eden, anti-Eden, specifically tied to the corruption of Eden, which you have supernatural rebellions lurking behind that, you have human rebellions lurking behind that, and they are basically symbiotically related. My fullest expression of that to date is in the Demons book, where I try to flesh all that out in detail. There's a little bit of an unseen realm, but the Demons book sort of takes up that cause, as it were, to go after the three rebellions explanation for why the world is a chaotic mess. So when I say chaos, I'm referring to the loss of Eden, everything that is not Eden, which means it's things associated with death, disorder, the decreation of the order that God instituted in Genesis 1. These sorts of themes: death, decay, loss, estrangement from God, fragmentation of humanity. All of this stuff is chaos. And Babel is a sort of a center point. Most obviously, the third rebellion, what happens at Babel with the fragmentation of humanity and the sons of God being assigned to the nations. But the other ones also have certain threads that connect them as well to the Babel theme, because geographically, if we take the geographical descriptions, like Genesis 6, it's Noah, the flood, we're in the Mesopotamian part of the world. And the imagery of the flood, again, is often a theological response or polemic to material from Mesopotamia. So there's that. And if you go even back to the first one, there's a good bit of material in Genesis 3, this first rebellion, that also connects in some way to Babylonian material. I mean, there's it's not that it's isolated to Babylon. You've got Canaan material as well, Canaanite. But if you loop in the Ezekiel 28 repurposing of this supernatural rebellion and the divine council, well, Ezekiel obviously writing from Babylon, there you go. So there's a number of things going on here that just connects all of it, the whole chaotic mess, to Babylon, both in terms of the history of the biblical story as it's told, again, the geographical orientation, the textual material that's used to tell the story, and then ultimately Babylon becomes the foil, for all that is terrible, all that, this ultimate reversal, like in the exile. Before that, you get Egypt playing the big bad role, and then you get Assyria, and then you get Babylon. But it's interesting how all three are described in chaos terms, and a number of which are Babylonish, even if it's not Babylon itself, even if it's Egypt or Assyria or something like that. So there are a lot of interconnections here. Again, it would take a whole book, to ferret out all of them and just go through all the material. But I think that's a necessary backdrop, because if we look at Revelation 13 sort of generally as the war against chaos, or chaos's war against the people of God and the plans of God, that opens the door a bit to the less expected backdrop to the two beasts. Okay, the first one is Daniel in Babylon, Daniel 7. That's going to be easy when we go through it to see that. But the other one is a little bit unexpected. So I'm going to start with the lesser expected of the two. So of the two trajectories, let's go to, for example, the beasts of Job. Okay, Job 40 and 41. You have the sea beast and the land beast. Elsewhere in Scripture, they're going to be described as Leviathan, and the twisting serpent, Leviathan, the chaos imagery that basically is known throughout the ancient Near East. And the land equivalent to chaos is Rahab. Okay, the land counterpart to Leviathan is Rahab. You actually get Rahab, mentioned in the same chaos context as Leviathan normally is in Psalm 89, for instance. So there's a land and a sea chaos monster, two of them in the Old Testament. And what again, this isn't unique to me. I'm going to quote from Beale and McDonough here in a moment, but You've got scholars, again, who have obviously noticed this, and they're well acquainted with the land and the sea chaos beast from the Old Testament. And so this seems like a natural trajectory to follow. So Beale and McDonough write, this is again from the commentary of the Old Testament in the New Testament, edited by Carson and Beale. They say the depiction of the two beasts in chapter 13 is based in part, and again, that's appropriately worded, in part on Job 40 and 41, which is the only place in the Old Testament that portrays two satanic beasts that oppose God. The only time where they're together. Elsewhere, they're separate, Leviathan, Rahab, so on and so forth. The sea monster of the Job passage also has a companion classified as a land beast. The term is Therion, in Septuagint anyway. That's Job 40, 15 through 24. Now, both beasts are described with demonic attributes and are said to have been, quote, made to be mocked by the angels. Now, you don't, if you're quickly looking back and what was the verse there? Okay, it's Job 40, 19 and 20, and Job 41, 24 and 25, more importantly. You're not going to find it because this is the Septuagint. So I'm going to just open the Septuagint here real quickly and read some of this stuff, because again, since we don't really read the Septuagint, this is a little bit surprising. So wait till you hear this. So Job, let's just go to Job 40 in the Septuagint. So Job 40, 19 and 20. This is describing again Leviathan. So I'll go up to verse 18. If a flood should happen, it is not taken notice of it. Trust that the Jordan shall rush up to its mouth. Shall one take it in its eye? Again, describing, basically creatures of the deep and, their effect on the land in this flood language, so on and so forth. Being caught in a snare, shall one pierce its nose? Now that's language that's going to be familiar from your English Bibles about Leviathan. Verse 20, and you will lead the serpent in by a fish hook and put a halter, or it's a question, and will you lead the serpent in by a fish hook and put a halter around its nose? Obviously, no. Job, you can't control, Leviathan. It's Leviathan. You're no match for it. If you keep reading in Job 41, again, in the Septuagint, here are the last two verses. There is nothing upon the earth like it, being made to be mocked at by my angels. It sees everything that is high, and it itself is king of all that is in the waters. So it's real interesting, again, in the Septuagint, you've got the big symbol for chaos, the Leviathan, the sea beast, is going to be mocked by the angels. Now I'm going to go back to Beale and McDonough. They keep going with this trajectory. The two beasts of Job 40 and 41 are echoed throughout Revelation 13, again, especially in the Septuagint. Because Revelation is Greek, Septuagint is Greek in these two chapters. One is called a dragon from the sea. That's Job 40, 25. Again, the vocabulary is going to be shared between the Revelation and Job on these points. The land beast is to be slain by God with a sword. Again, later in Revelation 13, you get that, and that's Job 40, 19. The sea dragon conducts a war waged by his mouth. It's Job 40, 32. And if you recall Revelation 13, the beast is speaking great things against, God. Back to Beale and McDonough. So the sea dragon conducts a war waged by his mouth, and burning torches, quote unquote, and a flame goes out of his mouth. It's Job 41, 11 and 13, again, the Septuagint. There's nothing upon the earth like him. Job 41, 25. Again, going back to Revelation 13, this description of the beast as being like unique. I mean, it's the ultimate beast, the ultimate, chaos figure here. Beale and McDonough also say Jewish tradition held that on the fifth day of creation, God created Leviathan to be in the sea, and Behemoth, in the land counterpart, to dwell on the land. So you have Behemoth, also known as Rahab, and they give some references here. 1 Enoch 60, 7 through 10, 4 Ezra 6, 49 through 52. And some scattered rabbinic texts. I mean, this is a Jewish tradition that, God created both of these. These two beasts were symbolic of the powers of evil and were to be destroyed at the final judgment. Now, that part there, the destruction of Rahav and Leviathan at the final judgment, elsewhere in other episodes on the podcast, we've actually gotten into this because this is part of their destruction, is part of what scholars call the divine banquet motif. The final Passover, the final, the Christians would call it the marriage supper of the Lamb, this great eschatological meal with God and with his people. And I've asked before, well, hey, do you know what's being served at this meal? And in Jewish tradition, the answer was, yeah, Rahav, the behemoth, and Leviathan. That's what's on the table. And it was a way of expressing the idea that chaos itself is going to be devoured. It's going to come to an end. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from Brant Pitre's book, Jesus and the Last Supper, about this Jewish theme, this theology. Again, this whole idea, I'm going to start where he's discussing the image of a banquet, or this divine banquet idea in the Old Testament. So he writes this. Again, this is his book called Jesus and the Last Supper. Multiple passages in the Jewish scripture use the image of a banquet or feast to describe the joy of the coming age of salvation. However, by far the most explicit description of an eschatological banquet in the Old Testament is in the book of Isaiah. In the midst of a series of descriptions of the coming day of the Lord, in Isaiah 24 through 27, the prophet speaks of a future banquet for Israel and the nations. Then he starts to list out certain features of this banquet. So he writes, first, the coming feast is no ordinary banquet. It is an eschatological event. This eschatological dimension is evident from the fact that the banquet culminates in the overthrow of suffering and death. God will, quote, swallow up death forever, unquote, and wipe away tears from all faces. Indeed, just a few verses after describing the banquet, Isaiah goes on to speak about the resurrection of the bodies of the dead, Isaiah 26:19. As Klausner suggests, the overall context of the banquet is Isaiah's vision of the cessation of death and the resurrection of the dead in the age to come. Second, the banquet is a feast of redemption. It will be tied to the forgiveness of sins. At the time of the banquet, God will take away, quote, the reproach of his people, unquote, and give them salvation. It's Isaiah 25:8-9. Basically, once, let me just interrupt here. The Messiah, again, the coming of Jesus in the New Testament, the first time around, was a signal that the exile is now ending. But the exile, this is an already but not yet thing. The exile isn't completely over until everything comes full circle. And not only God's people, Israel, but also those from the nations who follow the Lord are brought back into the family. They're no longer in exile. They're home. And this is, again, a day of the Lord, final eschatological event. Back to Pitre. Third, the coming feast will be a cultic or sacrificial banquet. This is the meaning of the strange imagery of some of the language, fat things and wine on the lees. This is technical terminology for sacrificial offerings of the temple cult, as when Deuteronomy speaks of, quote, the fat of their sacrifices, and, quote, the wine of their drink offering, unquote. Deuteronomy 32:37-38, Leviticus 3:3, Leviticus 4:8-9. This cultic dimension is important to stress since Isaiah explicitly states that the banquet will take place, quote, on the mountain of the Lord, which in context refers to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. That's Isaiah 24:23. Yet another reason why the Lord appears, the whole Battle of Armageddon thing, it's Jerusalem. Okay, it's Zion. It's not Megiddo, it's Zion. It's the Har Mohed, the Mount of Assembly. Again, the mount where the divine council is. Okay, all that stuff. That's unseen realm material, obviously. Fourth, back to Pitre, in Isaiah, the eschatological banquet will be an international banquet, which will include both the restored tribes of Israel and the Gentile nations. The feast will be, quote, for all peoples, unquote, and will result in the veil that is cast over all the nations, or Gentiles, the Goyim in Hebrew, being lifted. This is a startlingly universal vision of salvation nestled right in the heart of one of the most widely read prophets of the Old Testament. Fifth, and finally, given again, a focus on Moses and Mount Sinai, which he had done earlier in his book. It is significant that several scholars have suggested that the banquet in Isaiah 25 alludes to and is modeled on the heavenly banquet of Moses and the elders atop Mount Sinai. Remember that? That's from Exodus 24, 9 through 11. They go up and they see the God of Israel. They have a meal with the God of Israel. Now, other banquet texts that he gets into in the book, obviously we don't have time to go through all these. Isaiah 55, 1 through 3, 62, 8 and 9, 65, 13, 65, 17 and 18, Zechariah 9, 11 and 12, Zechariah 9, 16 and 17. This is it's not a little thing. It's not a little theme. It's not like just one passage. It's not just Isaiah 24 through 27, but you've got a number of places that talk about this eschatological banquet with these themes. Petre also writes, perhaps the most elaborate description of the Messianic banquet comes to us from Second Baruch. Again, this is Second Temple Jewish literature, pseudepigraphical literature in this case, which is commonly dated to the 1st century AD. Although the text is long, it is worth quoting in full, as it is perhaps the most full-blown expectation of the Messianic feast from the period. So he's going to quote this Second Baruch passage. I'm going to quote at least part of it here. It reads, "And it will happen that when all that which should come to pass in these parts has been accomplished, the Messiah will begin to be revealed. And Behemoth," there's the land beast, "will reveal itself from its place, and Leviathan will come from the sea. The two great monsters which I created on the 5th day of creation, which I shall have kept until that time. And they," the two monsters, "will be nourishment for all who are left. The earth will also yield fruits 10,000-fold, and on one vine will be 1,000 branches, and one branch will produce 1,000 clusters, and one cluster will produce 1,000 grapes, and one grape will produce a core of wine. And those who are hungry will enjoy themselves, and they will moreover see marvels every day." And this is the new earth description, okay? "For winds will go out in front of me every morning to bring the fragrance of aromatic fields, and clouds at the end of the day to distill the dew of health. And it will happen at that time that the treasury of manna will come down again from on high." Would you like bread with your meal? They're serving bread with Leviathan and Behemoth. "And they will eat of it in those years, because these are they who will have arrived at the consummation of time. And it will happen after these things that when the time of the appearance of the Anointed One, the Messiah, has been fulfilled, and he returns with glory, then all who sleep in hope of him will rise." There's the general resurrection. Dead in Christ will rise first, okay? "And it will happen at that time that those treasuries will be opened, in which the number of the souls of the righteous were kept, and they will go out, and the multitudes of the souls will appear together in one assemblage of one mind. And the first ones will enjoy themselves, and the last ones will not be sad." Everybody's going to love to be there. "For they know that the time has come of which it is said that it is the end of times." And that's 2 Baruch 29, on into chapter 30. Several aspects of this grand vision are worth highlighting. Petre, again, chimes in. First, the banquet is both eschatological and explicitly messianic, directly tied to the coming of the Anointed One at the end of times. Second, it is important to stress that eating in the Messianic age takes place not on a single occasion, but every day. Hence, the Messianic banquet not only marks the beginning of the eschatological age, but is a feature of it in perpetuity. Third, the banquet is described in terms evocative of the exodus from Egypt. Its commencement will be marked by the return of the manna from heaven. It will take place alongside the return of the heavenly dew that brought the manna in the first place, Exodus 16, 13, and 14. Even the image of the superabundant wine and enormous clusters of grapes harks back to the gathering of the grapes in the land of Canaan by the emissaries of Joshua at the end of the Exodus. It's Numbers 13, 21 through 24. Fourth, and quite memorably, the righteous can also expect to feed on the flesh of Leviathan and Behemoth. It is not clear whether this image is hyperbolic and figurative or is intended as a literal description of the viands of the banquet. Either way, it seems to represent the triumph of the righteous over the destructive powers of this world. And lastly, but by no means least significantly, the inauguration of the Messianic banquet directly precedes the return of the Messiah to heaven and the resurrection of the righteous dead. So the Messiah comes and he goes, back to heaven. This is a Jewish portrait here. For a Christian in the book of Revelation, you would say the Messiah returns and heaven returns to earth. And so we transition from the return of the Messiah on into, again, the new earth, new heavens and new earth. It's right there. So back to Petre. The banquet begins to be celebrated on earth during the days of the Messiah. It finds its ultimate fulfillment in the return of the pre-existent Messiah. There's an already but not yet even in Judaism. Apparently along with the resurrected righteous to heaven. Again, so this is common in Christian theology as well, that heaven, where we're going to be forever, is not the new earth. I actually believe it is the new earth. But this is very common to have heaven be some sort of non-earth ethereal existence. And of course, that never answers the question, well, what happens to the new earth then? Is it empty? But again, that's just me. I don't want to drift off into too many of my own criticisms of sort of a standard view. So back to Petre. Just as the righteous on earth enjoy themselves during the days of the Messiah by eating the manna, so too those who are raised from the dead will enjoy themselves in the heavenly assemblage of the exalted Messiah. So again, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the idea that these two beasts are ultimately chaos symbols. It's very obvious, Leviathan and Rahab, or Leviathan and Behemoth, if you like the Behemoth term, who wreak misery and destruction until they are defeated. And these two beasts may very well be what is behind the two beasts, one from the sea, one from the land, of Revelation 13. Now, that's actually the minority view. And it's really because of the prominence of Daniel 7 throughout Revelation 13 that this view is minority. And let's be honest, most people who are writing popular prophecy stuff, they're completely unaware of this. Maybe they're out, maybe they've just have heard so many times, or maybe even taught Leviathan, that's a dinosaur or something like that. And they miss all of this imagery. They miss all of the Second Temple Jewish, understanding of these images, these symbols, and what they mean with the eschatological banquet. I mean, it's all there. And it's frankly all there somewhere in the book of Revelation. It's just sort of a Christianized version of it, because now we're post-Jesus now when we're writing the book of Revelation. Again, we're not thinking completely like a Jew who either was writing before Jesus or has rejected Jesus. So Revelation is going to be a little bit different, but it's going to dip into all these wells. Okay. But again, most of your popular prophecy writing is just completely unaware of this, and they're very much aware of the next one, and that's the Daniel 7 one. So the second view is more common and more likely. I mean, it's very likely. I mean, there's a lot of secure roots here, but I still think that the first view is also on the table. I don't think we have to pick and choose one. I think they're both being utilized by John and repurposed. So I'm in agreement with Beale here that Job 40 and 41, the Leviathan and Behemoth, do play some role in what's going on in Revelation 13, but that is not to ignore or sidestep Daniel 7. So the second view here is that the beasts are accountable through this passage in Daniel. So Beale and McDonough write, sort of in summary, a few things here. They say the material in Revelation 13, 1 and 2 is a creative reworking of Daniel 7, 1 through 7, the beast coming up from the sea, and his 10 horns in Revelation 13 are based respectively on Daniel 7, verses 2 and 3, and Daniel 7, verses 7, 20, and 24. Again, it's very obvious. They write, many will understand the 7 heads as a reference to an ancient Near Eastern sea monster myth from before the time of Daniel. He's referring here to the Ugaritic stuff, the defeat of Yam, the defeat of Leviathan, who is Yam in Ugaritic texts. And so he cites some Ugaritic texts here. He also cites Psalm 74, Psalm 89:10, Isaiah 27:1, because those passages dip in on a linguistic level, the terminology, into Ugaritic material. So he's saying, some understand the 7 heads this way. It's about this Canaanite depiction. They write, this is possible, but it is better to view the 7 heads as a composite of the heads of all 4 of the beasts of Daniel 7. That might sound a little awkward. Let me just break in again, but basically what they're gonna do in what they write is they're gonna take Revelation 13's description, and there are various elements that are found in Daniel 7, but they're not drawn out in the same order as the beast of Daniel 7. It's sort of a scattershot assemblage that, this comes from beast number 1, that one's beast number 4, this was beast number 3, but they're all applied to these two beasts in Revelation. So they think it's just best to, view the 7 heads for one, and there's going to be other features that as just sort of John is looking back at Daniel 7 and pulling things from any of the beasts at any given point. But Daniel 7 is the pool from which he does it. So back to Beale and McDonough, they write, the 10 diadems upon the 10 horns are a reference to Daniel's 4th beast, whose 10 horns are interpreted as 10 kings. That's Daniel 7:24. Likewise, the blasphemous names are connected with the blaspheming figure of Daniel 7, 8, and 11, who is also associated with the 4th kingdom, just like he is in Revelation 13, 5, and 6, or just like the blasphemy is. In Revelation 13:2, they note, whereas in Daniel 7, 3 through 8, the images of the lion, bear, leopard, and terrifying beast represent 4 successive world empires, in Revelation 13, 1 to 2, all 4 of these images are applied to one beast. This probably includes a connotation of Rome as the 4th beast, which Daniel predicted would be more powerful and dreadful than the previous 3 beasts of Daniel 7, 4 through 6. Now, what they don't say there, I'll break in again, is that if you parallel Daniel 7 with Daniel 2, the kingdom of God begins, the mountain not made with human hands, okay, that destroys the toes, all right? That is associated with the kingdom of God. That is the kingdom of God. In fact, Daniel is very pointed about saying that. Well, when does the kingdom of God get rolling? When does it take a foothold, pardon the pun? Well, that's during the time of the Messiah. And at the time of the Messiah, what was the world empire? It's Rome. So, Rome is a pretty secure hook here into all this. Now, I'm going to just go through Revelation 13, not verse by verse, but I'm going to pick things from different verses and just sort of link them back to Daniel 7, because this is what Beale and McDonough do in their commentary at this point. So, Revelation 13:3. Let me just read that. Revelation 13:3 says, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. So there's that statement. And then a little bit later, in verse 14, it says that the beast was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Again, so it's apparently it's cast a sort of a wound that should normally be fatal, but it lives. So they write, Beale and McDonough write, in Revelation 13:14, it is added that it was a sword that struck the beast's head. The added mention of the sword in this connection recalls the prophecy of Isaiah 27:1 in the Septuagint. Here we are back to the Leviathan thing, which says, quote, in that day God will bring the sword and the holy and great mighty sword upon the dragon, the fleeing serpent upon the dragon, the crooked serpent. So if you're looking at that element, that actually goes back to the first view that we're dealing with the 2 chaos monsters here, because it's a pretty clear allusion back to Isaiah 27, verse 1. If we go to Revelation 13:4, the phrase denoting authority probably goes back to Daniel 7:6, even though if we're reading the Septuagint of Daniel 7, this is going to be said of the 3rd beast in particular. But again, the argument is, and I think it's a reasonable argument, that since all of the features of Daniel 7 or the beast, the things about all the beasts in Daniel 7, John is drawing on all those things to portray 2 beasts, and most of them specifically go to the 1st beast. But verse 4 says they worship the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, so on and so forth. So that's probably an allusion. The argument is back to Daniel 7:6. Let me just read that. Daniel 7:6. I'll read it in English, not from the Septuagint. Let's see here. As I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, 4 wings of a bird on its back. The beast had 4 heads, and dominion, i.e. authority, was given to it. So there seems to be a connection there. Revelation 13:5 and 6. The reference in verse 5 to the beast expressing his authority through speech has clear parallels in Daniel 7, verse 6, verse 8, verse 11, verse 20, and verse 25. Specifically, if you're looking at this in the Septuagint, in Daniel 7, verse 6 and verse 8, we read that a tongue was given to the beast, a mouth speaking great things. And again, that you get a good bit of that vocabulary in verses 5 and 6 in Revelation 13. Here's what it says. The beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling. So the beast was given, a mouth, or he's given, again, this ability to speak. The given terminology is a little odd, but it actually comes from Daniel 7. That's the language there. Verse 7. In Revelation 13:7, the first part of it, the focus shifts back again to the prophecy of Daniel 7. So in verse 7, we have here, the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And again, authority was given to it over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So if we go to Daniel 7 in the Septuagint, and I think it's around, verse 8. Let's just read Daniel 7:8. And indeed, many councils were being given among its horns, and behold, a different horn sprang up in the middle of them, a small one among its horns. And 3 of the previous horns dried up on account of it, and behold, eyes just like human eyes were in this horn, and a mouth speaking great boastful things. And it began to make war against the holy ones. And it's very clearly the source for Revelation 13 in verse 7. Go on to verse 10. Beale and McDonough write this. Let me just read verse 10 here. If anyone is to be taken captive, or to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. This is a call for the endurance of the faith of the saints. So they write, again, this phrase, if anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he must go, and so on, is a paraphrase combining Jeremiah 15:2, Jeremiah 43:11. Where Jeremiah prophesies to Israel that God has destined them to go into captivity and suffer from the sword. This is a penalty for their unbelief and sin. In the present context here in Revelation 13, it appears to apply to genuine believers, though, who suffer persecution for their witness. Again, that I can see where you could go with that direction. In the Septuagint, again, what they're doing throughout their whole treatment of this is they're comparing the Greek of Revelation to, they're looking up these terms, this vocabulary in the Septuagint. And you find out that the vocabulary here from verse 10 is a mixture from these 2 verses in Jeremiah. So you have the people of God, not going into exile because of sin, that was the Jeremiah context, but the people of God suffering because of the beasts, because they're under persecution. It's just that John draws this language. So many have noticed that these beasts, just generally, this is just, I'm interjecting again. You probably noticed at this point that the beasts sort of imitate Christ in certain ways. You have this lethal wound that gets healed, for instance. You've got this authority, given, it's illegitimate authority, but yet, again, some of this language you could find in Daniel 7 for the Son of Man and being given the kingdom and everlasting dominion and all this. But, it seems like there's this counterfeit thing going on, which would make sense because what we're headed to now is the mark of the beast, and the mark is a number and a name. You bear the name of the beast. I think this is a good place to bring this up because really bearing the name is behind the name of the beast idea, not the number itself, but the concept of bearing the name, which is very Old Testament. We had Carmen Imes on. This is what her whole book is about, bearing the name at Sinai, this thing about how in ancient Israel, there was this concept. It's really imaging, but in the book of Exodus and throughout the Torah, the idea of imaging God, being God's proxy, as it were, gets recycled and re-expressed in terms of bearing the name of Yahweh every day in life and among the nations. You represent him. You are his proxies. You are his kingdom of priests, a holy nation. You corporately, the whole country, the whole nation was supposed to represent him. They were supposed to be his image, and they bore his name. We're going to get into some Torah passages here that talk about this. But if that's the case, again, then what you have here is the beasts, and again, ultimately with this number and so on and so forth, this is a counterfeit idea. Now, for Christians who read the book of Revelation, they can see the Antichrist, the false Christ idea, the opposer Christ, or poser Christ, I guess you could say. I tend to think of Antichrist not as being a sort of fake, but as being a sort of a mirror counterpart enemy, that sort of thing. So that's very common for believers, who are studying Scripture and getting into prophecy to see that. But what they don't see is how the name of the beast, bearing the name, is also a counterfeit. And on the other side of it is bearing the name of Christ. And both of these they're really metaphors, okay, for who you align yourself with, who you represent. Just whose proxy are you? Are you the proxy of the God of Israel and Jesus, or are you the proxy of the beast? Okay, this is what bearing the name refers to. So we often don't see that because maybe we're just too fixated on what the number means, or Antichrist, the false Christ. Okay, I get that, but there's an anti-name bearing thing going on here too. It's a pseudo counterpart, and if you have that in your head, then at least the rationale, at least the concept of bearing the mark, which is the name of the beast, okay, that has an Old Testament flavor to it that makes it comprehensible. It's not about wearing barcodes, okay? It's not about stuff like this. It's about whose side are you on? And yeah, you could talk about how believers or whoever in the world might be manipulated into turning against the Lord and following the beast. I understand that. There's a lot of latitude here as to how this would sort of get lived out if we were like right here present at the time, with all this stuff going on. But fundamentally, it is about what or who is your believing loyalty choice. Is it Jesus or is it the beast? Whose name do you bear? Okay. Who is your master? Who is your owner? Okay. All these things that go into name bearing as a concept. Now, I think again, this is really significant to observe. Beale and McDonough sort of touch on this. I think they could do a much better job of it than they do. Again, especially with the bearing of the name thing. But they do get into the idea of imitation. I'll just give you one paragraph, and this is worth noting. But again, I wish they would go further with the idea. They say the idea of imitation is carried on in 13:13. First, the beast's activities are described by an ironic echo of the acts of Moses, whose prophetic authority was validated by doing great signs. Let's go to Revelation 13:13. So what do we read there? It, again, the second beast, performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, so on and so forth. Well, yeah, you get Moses, if you want to associate that with Moses with the hail, okay, and just generally doing great signs. Okay, I get it. But it's actually more Elijah here. And they get to this point. They again, he lists out a few Exodus passages about Moses doing great signs and says this is a counter, what the beast is here is sort of a counterfeit of that. Even in the Exodus narrative, they write, Exodus 7:11, Pharaoh's magicians did the same signs with their secret arts. This is reinforced by Daniel, where God is praised for doing signs and wonders. And Daniel 4:37 in the Septuagint aligns very well in their notes to Revelation 13:13. The casting down of fire from heaven in the presence of people recalls the prophetic demonstration of Elijah, 1 Kings 18:38 and 39, and also 2 Kings 1:10 through 14. Though now, here in Revelation 13, it's a pseudo-prophetic action. Again, all of that is sure, but I wish they would do a little bit more with it. So better than pseudo-prophetic, I wish they would get into something like this. If Jesus is a superior Moses and a superior Elijah, and he is, and those ideas are present in the Gospels. Jesus is the new Moses. He is superior to Elijah, who is the forerunner. If that's the case, then these beasts mime both the idea of a pseudo-Christ, okay? They certainly do that, but when they do it, they are still, again, it's almost like a recognition of what or who they need to imitate to have legitimacy, because Christ is superior. And that's why it's happening this way. The beast is sort of trying to pass himself off as the, quote, new Moses and new Elijah. And it's a direct counterpart to the new Moses and superior to Elijah portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels. I just wish they would have spent more time on that. But anyway, let's get into the 666 a little bit. So we have it described in verses 17 and 18 as the number of a man. It's also described as the name of the beast. And so the imitation trajectory again makes sense, that except in this case, we're miming the followers of either Yahweh or Jesus or the beast. Again, who is your proxy? Or you're a proxy for whom, I should say. So if the point of 666 is bearing the name, and as followers of Christ bear his name, so the followers of the beast would bear that name. In other words, as we have people who align themselves with Jesus, their believing loyalty is in Jesus. You're going to have a lot of other people whose believing loyalty is in the beast. Now, Christians obviously didn't literally bear the name. I mean, they're not stamped or branded or anything like that. And neither did the Israelites, even when the name was given to them. Do you realize that the name was given to Israelites? This is number 6. I'm sure you've heard the passage. This is the priestly blessing, but the terminology, actually, matters here. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel." So God says to Moses, "Tell Aaron, this is what you say to the people. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." And here's verse 27. That's where the blessing ends, but we forget about verse 27. So shall they, again, the priests, the Aaronid priests, so shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. So the people of Israel bore the name. Not in a literalistic view, literalistic way, but that's what number 6 says. This is the result of it. So the mark is a parody of this idea. It's a fake. It's an imitation. It's a pseudo bearing the name idea. Spiritually speaking, whose side are you on? And we see this with 144,000 because they're sealed and marked. So the mark is a parody of that as well, but we miss this other corporate idea. Now, here's some commentators have looked at this and thought, well, okay, you say the Israelites didn't literally bear the name. We understand what's being meant there, but the name of the Lord actually does get described as being worn by Israelites on the forehead and the hand. And if this sounds a little strange, again, because that's where the mark of the beast goes, just let's Beale and McDonough summarize it this way. In the Old Testament, God told Israel that the Torah was to be, quote, as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, in order to remind them continually of their commitment and loyalty to God. This was done, that's Exodus 13:9, Exodus 13:16, Deuteronomy 6:8. This was done with phylacteries, leather pouches containing portions of Scripture worn on the forehead and arm. The New Testament equivalent is the invisible seal or name of God, Revelation 7:2 and 3. That's the 144,000. The forehead represents their ideological commitment, and the hand, the practical outworking of that commitment. Now, it's interesting that if the Greek word for hand, care, which is used here in Revelation 13, it can mean arm, even though that's rare. So I just want to throw that out. But again, I what do we think of the parallel? It's interesting. I actually think the Aaronic blessing captures the idea better, but it is nevertheless an interesting sort of point-for-point kind of analogy that could be made. Now, some scholars have taken this, the Jewish idea here, and they see again this counterpart in Revelation 13, and of course they're bound to speculate about the bad mark. All right, is there a literal equivalent somewhere in this, or is it all just sort of spiritual representation? I'm arguing for spiritual or theological representation. Bearing the name spiritual here is the point. You bear the mark, you bear the name of the beast, that means you're on his side. Just like the positive side, you bear the name of the Lord, you bear the name of Christ. You're not carrying a physical mark with you. It's just that's where your loyalty is. So I'm arguing that's the whole point of the bearing the name and the mark and all this stuff. But there are others, again, who try to find a more literal sort of equivalent. So Owen notes one second temple parallel. He says, according to 3 Maccabees 2, 28 and 29, Ptolemy IV Philopater, who lived he reigned 221 to 204 BC, inaugurated a program of persecution against Egyptian Jews in which he required them to enroll in a census and to be branded with the ivy leaf of Dionysus. Those who did not cooperate were executed. It is likely that Ptolemy IV, who was particularly devoted to Dionysus, also himself sported this brand. Again, well, is that really what John's thinking about? I don't know. It feels a little dubious to me, but I thought I would mention it. You have Psalms of Solomon, another possible point of reference. Again, this is Second Temple Jewish literature. Psalms of Solomon 15, 9 through 14 says this: they will flee from the holy ones like those pursued in battle. They will pursue and capture sinners. Those who do lawlessness will not escape the judgment of the Lord. They will be captured as if by experienced warriors. For the sign of destruction is upon their forehead, and the inheritance of sinners is destruction and darkness. Their lawless acts will pursue them to Hades below. Well, again, this stamping on the forehead thing, it's not really the same context. Here it's aimed against Jews. I doubt this is what John's thinking about. And I would say there's a general weak point to all of this, and that's the buying or the selling. So my own predilection here, if we'll get interpretive to this extent, is that I look at Revelation 13 with the two beasts, again, which I view as metaphors for chaos, basically the whole world gone to hell. And Christians, as a result, are persecuted by the chaos system. Part of that persecution is going to be you can't buy or sell. So that I take it as a point of oppression, but I don't think it's based upon a physical mark that anybody's taking. I do think it's based on the fact that you're a Christian. That's enough to target you, that you will refuse to denounce Christ, to deny Christ, and assign your loyalty to the beast, i.e. to the anti-Christ system. That alone is sufficient to say, well, you're not shopping here. So I that actually feels more sinister to me than, again, some of the scenarios that people come up with. But scholars try to ferret out possible ways that buying and selling fit in with a physical mark, and none of it has an Old Testament context. It's all Greco-Roman. So Owen, for instance, writes this: the connection of buying and selling with the charagma, that's the Greek term, the mark of the beast, has been understood as a reference to the use of Roman coins, which bore the portraits and names of Roman emperors. The inability to buy or sell would then be the result of refusing to use Roman coins. He writes, this has a parallel in the Jewish prohibition of images, which for some, such as the Zealots, included the image of the emperor on Roman coins. Well, really? I mean, it just feels weak. I mean, this is nice, but that isn't really what the passage describes, refusing to use coins. It says you can't buy or sell. It doesn't say that Christians refuse to use coins. It doesn't say that the image is on coins. The image is on the hand of the forehead. Okay, again, which has theological imagery to it that we've already talked about in this episode back into the Old Testament. The word of the Lord, again, the name being placed upon the people of God by the priests. To me, that makes a whole lot more sense than making the passage talk about, I don't want to use those coins. But again, this is kind of where people go. Now Owen knows this, and he admits later, he says, quote, "There's no evidence that people were stamped on their hands or foreheads with coin images." Well, no, there isn't. And so it's nice that we can, be forthright there, but I think he and other commentators more or less just struggle with this. So in the last part of our episode, what about the number itself? Well, I hate to disappoint people. Maybe you won't go away disappointed after I say what I say, but there's no real secure Old Testament contribution here. Now, when I say secure, I mean there's nothing that I can look at or anybody else can find in the text that really fits well with the number 666. In other words, it's not like, hey, we can go through Revelation 13, and there's like 30 places where we can see Daniel is quoted in the Septuagint. I mean, we just gave a little sampling here in this episode. There's nothing like that for the number. Typically what you get in commentaries is you get suggestions of people whose names could correspond to this. And they're all Greco-Roman. They all have weaknesses, which is, again, is why this hasn't been resolved. So the typical name explanations like Nero, well, yeah, Nero works if you spell his name a certain way. Like one of them is you add an N to it, which again, that was a spelling for Nero. So, okay. Domitian, you can get to Domitian through gematria, again, letters corresponding to numbers, depending on what the spelling used, depending on if you use sort of a nickname or an abbreviation part of it. It just feels like cheating at some point, okay? Another candidate would be Pythagorean magic squares. Magic squares are essentially Sudoku, where the vertical line, horizontal line, diagonal lines, they all add up to the same number, okay? So some have pointed out that 666 is the Pythagorean magic square of the sun. So now you get solar deity imagery in there. Zeus and whoever, Owen calls these triangular numbers, and so do other scholars, but magic square is what I'm used to. Again, is this really what we're talking about? Would John have known of the Pythagorean system? Now, there are actually serious weaknesses to the Pythagorean element here. And I've put this in the protected folder. I came across, I didn't have this earlier when we got to some of the numbers elsewhere, earlier in the book of Revelation, but I was able to procure something this week that I'm putting in the protected folder. And for those of you who are like really into Bible number stuff, this is the article. Okay. In other words, when I say that, this is the most thorough treatment of the subject. It's over 60 pages. It's by Adela Yarbrough Collins, and her treatment here is basically has not been superseded. So it's called Numerical Symbolism in Jewish and Early Christian Apocalyptic Literature. She goes through everything. Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, Enoch, New Testament, Pythagoras, all of it. Okay? It's a great article, but it doesn't solve the problem. All of these suggestions are Greco-Roman. Now, I find the one that's most intriguing, just to drift off into Greco-Roman land here, and there's a reason why I find it intriguing that does link back to the Old Testament, is Irenaeus' suggestion. And I wrote about this in Reversing Hermon, but I'm going to give you, this is John J. Collins in DDD. This is the first Collins. This is actually her husband. He has the entry on Titans in DDD, and he writes this. The name Titan, is not found as such in the writings of the New Testament, but may be hidden in 666, in Revelation 13:18, the number of the beast and also of a man. One of the solutions of this riddle that have been listed by Irenaeus actually lists a few of these, but this is the one that is most interesting. So Collins says one of the solutions happens to be Teiton. There's a specific spelling. And this is something Irenaeus brings up in his book, or his writing Against Heresies 5:30 and 3. So it happens to be Teiton, of which the numerical values 300 plus 5 plus 10 plus 300 plus 1 plus 50 add up to 666. Irenaeus comments that this solution is particularly convincing to himself, for is particularly convincing to himself because it is not the name of an actually venerated god or known king, but nevertheless a divine and kingly, even a tyrant's name. So it gave a certain flexibility. Interestingly enough, everybody says that the Nero thing solves the 666 problem. Irenaeus doesn't even bring it up. He doesn't even bring Nero up. He's well acquainted with Nero, folks. And he didn't find that at all persuasive or even interesting. So he takes this different trajectory. Now, why should we care? Again, I discussed this a bit in Reversing Hermann with 666 and Titan, Tayton. There's no direct Old Testament reference here. So it's an analogical argument. Basically, it goes like this. 666 points to a Titan. The Titans were the giants, okay, the Greco-Roman retelling of Genesis 6. One of those was Nimrod in Jewish tradition. Not in the Bible. Nimrod is called a Gibor, and Gibor does not have to mean giant. David is called a Gibor. God is called a Gibor. Okay, it doesn't have to mean giant. So let's get that straight. But you go from 666 to Titans, to giants, to Nimrod. And Nimrod, of course, is associated with, drum roll please, Babel. And of course, Revelation's Antichrist is associated with Babylon the great whore. Again, there's no biblical text that makes those connections, but they're interesting. So I wrote in Reversing Hermann this little bit here. The point being made here is not that Antichrist will be a giant. Okay, please. No biblical or Enochic text draws such a conclusion. Rather, the material indicates that Second Temple Jewish readers of Revelation may have parsed the Antichrist as having a direct association with the fallen watchers, the classical Titans, and the giants. That's possible. And the Nimrod trajectory establishes that possibility. So I kind of like that because I think that there is the number has something to do with Babel. That's kind of obvious, though, because keep reading Revelation, you get Babylon, the great whore. I mean, that's kind of obvious. So I'm not like patting myself on the back here that I've seen something, that no one else has seen. Everybody sees this who reads it. So what I'm interested in is what's the Babel connection? Now, we certainly have a chaos connection with the two beasts. That's in play, absolutely. And then we get this number, and what I want to see, where I think the answer is going to be, and we may never find it, but it's going to have some connection to Babel chaos stuff. Now, I have to mention one other thing. I also recently came across an article that tries to make the argument 666 from the Old Testament, and I don't find this persuasive at all. I'm going to tell you why, but I also put this in the protective folder. So 666 as a number is actually mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament. The first one is that it's the number of the talents of gold that Solomon collected each year. It's mentioned in 1 Kings 10:14, 2 Chronicles 9:13. So those are 2 of the references. The third reference is Ezra 2:13, where Adonijam has 666 sons, descendants. Okay, well, that's it. There's nothing to build on there. There's nothing said about Adonijam and all this stuff. So that's where you get the number. Now, this particular article by Brent Strawn and Keith Bodner, entitled Solomon and 666, Revelation 13:18. This is from New Testament Studies, volume 66, which is 2020. So it's very recent. Pages 219 to 319. Well, I messed up the numbers here. I can't remember what page numbers it actually is, and I don't want to open the file right now. But it's 8-10 pages. It's not real long. Here's what they argue. This is from their abstract. The present article argues that 666 in Revelation 13:18 is best related to the notice of Solomon receiving 666 talents of gold. 1 Kings 10:14, 2 Chronicles 9:13, which is in turn an important notice of this king's wayward and unjust practices, his inordinate wealth, exploitation of his own people, and eschewing of God's law. So basically, in non-academies, Solomon got 666 talents of gold. He got lots of other stuff too, but the 666 talents, and that shows that Solomon was an evil, sinister monarch that was just milking everybody for his wealth, and he exploited his own people. And this is one of the things that you're not supposed to do as a king according to the Torah. And so that becomes why we see 666 used of the Antichrist. Yeah, I don't find this at all persuasive for one big reason. And they actually try to address this in the article and do not do a good job of it. Solomon's portrayal in Second Temple Jewish literature is not a bad one. He's an exorcist. He has power over demons. Basically, he's the exact opposite of what he would be if he turns out to be the foil or the touch point for the Antichrist. So I think this is really weak. But I wanted to mention it because some of you will know that the number 666 occurs in the Old Testament. There you go. Again, I just don't find that option persuasive. I don't find any of the Greco-Roman options persuasive. I'll admit that I'm influenced by Irenaeus here. If he yawned at the suggestion of Nero, well, to me that says something. And again, all of these systems that try to align with certain names, they kind of cheat a little bit, to make it work. None of these things has won the day. The closest you get to a consensus is the Nero thing, but people are very quick to point out that you have to fiddle a little bit. The one advantage it has is it also accounts for the textual variance, 616. Some passages or some manuscripts of Revelation 13:18 do not say 666; they say 616. And if you spell Nero an altogether different way, you can get 616. So it can account for both of them. But to me, that just sort of demonstrates somewhat the artificiality of it. And again, if Irenaeus just thought, why would we even think that? To me, that suggests something there. That to me, that's actually a strong argument that we don't need to take Nero too seriously, because Irenaeus is very close, a lot closer than we are to the period. He's, one of the early fathers. He knows all about Nero because Nero put Paul and Peter to death. I mean, you would think if this idea of Nero being the beast, this Nero, this legend of Nero being revived and all this stuff, you think as sort of how that circulated, and it did circulate in the ancient world. People were freaked out by Nero that he would come back from the dead and all this, not even for biblical reasons, just generally. There's that. It's current. People are thinking about it. They're talking about it. They fear it. You've got this number thing going on, and Irenaeus doesn't even bat an eye, not even on the radar. Gives it no consideration at all. Again, to me, that is a good argument against it. So again, none of these things are going to solve the problem. Just to summarize here as we close, the one I prefer again is, I'll prefer something that has a connection to Babel. And right now, all you have is an analogous reasoning chain, that goes back to Taitan, the Titans, and Hermon, and Nimrod, and all this kind of stuff. You have to dip into Second Temple Jewish thinking about Nimrod. And equate him with Babel, and it's possible. All these things are possible. All the elements of this logic chain are possible. The problem is that the logic chain is never spelled out in Scripture. Not even part of the logic chain is spelled out in Scripture. All of the links in the chain are isolated from each other, scripturally speaking, except for Nimrod and Babel. That's about the only one you've got. There's a direct connection there. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in the quandary that we started with. Nobody knows really what this specifically is talking about, and there really isn't a clear Old Testament precedent. Maybe what I've just suggested is the right way to think about it. I don't know, neither does anybody else, because we're dealing with really the absence of data when it comes to text, at least to this point, as far as I've been able to find. And I've looked at a lot of stuff, so I'm not holding my breath. But that's kind of where we are with the whole issue. So the real meat here is with the beasts. I think it helps. I think it helps solidify a chaos orientation to the whole chapter. And again, with that, we'll bring this one to a close. That's really the Old Testament contribution to Revelation 13.
Well, Mike, Revelation 14, we're in the thick of it here. You've got some good stuff for us today?
Yeah, we're going to get through the chapter in part because the first 5 verses we've essentially already covered before. So we might as well just jump in here so that we can get through the whole chapter. The first 5 verses are the 144,000. And so we're not going to repeat that material. You can go back and listen to episodes 372 and 373 for all of that. So we're going to jump in at verse 6. So Revelation 14:6. And I'm going to read to about verse 13. So Revelation 14:6. We're going to get 3 angels here that have messages. So verse 6 says, "Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead, with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. And he said with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water.' Another angel, a second, followed, saying, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality.' And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, 'If anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their deeds follow them.'" So that's Revelation 14:6 through 13. And a couple of comments on certain, a few things in here. First, the reference to the angel flying isn't proof that angels have wings. I thought I would throw this in here because of what I've said and written in the past. In other contexts where non-bird things fly, like the woman of Revelation 12, they are given wings, but we don't get that detail here. So if we look up the terminology in LSJ, which is the Liddell Scott Greek lexicon, elsewhere in classical Greek, this same term that's used in Revelation 14:6 is used of flight that does not require wings. For example, the flight of the soul, the flight of horses and chariots, the flight of javelins, the flight of dancers. It's really used of any quick motion. If you're looking for a specific textual reference, the Iliad 22, line 362 would be one. But LSJ has all these sorts of things laid out. So this doesn't, again, prove that angels have wings. And On, in his Revelation commentary, actually bothers to comment about this, which I thought was kind of interesting. He says, "It is of interest that this is the earliest reference in Jewish or Christian literature to an angel, apart from cherubim and seraphim, flying. While cherubim and seraphim are described as having wings and as flying, angels in general are not." Okay, and he has here 1 Chronicles 21:16 merely states that the angel of the Lord was seen standing between heaven and earth, not that he had wings or was flying. Even in Revelation 14:6, however, the flying angel is not necessarily described as winged. It isn't described as winged. The first clear reference to angels and demons with wings is found in Tertullian, in his Apologia. So it's the early church fathers is where you first get the winged description applied specifically to angels. So there you go. I mean, this is church tradition. It's just, something that, it is what it is. It's nothing sinister or evil or anything like that. But I thought I should mention this because, the Angels book and things we've said on the podcast before. So I just thought it was interesting, too, that On even bothered, to comment on it. But he did. Now, there's a cosmological note to be made here, and we've commented a little bit on this language in an earlier episode about this sort of spatial area, the midst of heaven or mid-heaven. And On notes here we go back to Revelation 14:6. He sees the angel flying directly overhead. Directly overhead, this phrase is the same terminology that we saw earlier that denotes mid-heaven. Okay, so On writes this. The phrase petamenon en mesuranemati, flying in mid-heaven, means that the angel appeared in the place where he could be seen and heard by everyone on earth, since his message was directed to all human beings. Now, here's the interesting part. This, of course, presupposes a world shaped like a flat disk rather than a sphere. While Aristotle thought the earth was spherical, and he gives a reference in Aristotle, it was more commonly thought to be flat and circular, with Delphi at the center and surrounded by ocean, that's Herodotus 549, or flat and rectangular, Ephorus of Syme according to Strabo 1.2.28. This conception of a flat, circular earth survived into Hellenistic and Roman times. So this again denotes this sort of what I would call this pre-scientific, pre-modern, cosmology. And it does make sense of the phrase flying in mid-heaven. If that means in a place sort of in, above the middle of the earth, I mean, think of the earth as a round, disk, then the description has meaning, because this is where you would go to make sure everybody hears you. You're at a central location, as opposed to going to one end or the other, or the edge of the circle or whatever, So there's actually a point to the language here, but the point is communicated by means of language that denotes this pre-modern, cosmology. The first angel's message, this one in Revelation 14, is referred to as, the Greek term is actually the term for gospel, euangelion. So in Revelation 14:6, ESV translates that the angel had an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth, to every tribe and nation and language and people. So this is the normal word for, what you get in the New Testament for, referring to Jesus' work on the cross and the resurrection, so on and so forth. Here, it seems better to translate it just as a good news or good message, since the content of what this gospel, quote unquote gospel, is defined in verse 7, which says, and he said, here's the angel talking now, he said with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and sea and the springs of water. You say, well, how is that good news? Well, it's good news to the righteous, because they are about to be vindicated. Babylon is about to fall. The Lord is going to step in now into history and judge the wicked. He's going to put an end to the chaos system. So you go to verse 8 and you get the second angel. That angel's message is, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Now that phrase, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, derives from Isaiah 21, verse 9. So I'm going to read that. Isaiah 21, verse 9. And it says here, behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered to the ground. So again, this is a judgment passage. The Lord, is judging Babylon in Isaiah 21. And so that's the context for what John has written here. Now, if you tie that into the earlier, verse about proclaiming to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, and language and people. Okay, fear God. Here's the content of the good news before we hear that Babylon has fallen. Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him. Okay, all of you out there in all nations, all tribes, all languages and people, worship him. Worship Yahweh who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. Again, this combination of things in these verses, you can probably already tell this is the Psalm 82 judgment. This is the reversal of the Deuteronomy 32 problem. It's the judgment. This is day of the Lord language, Babylon, the whole chaos system. Of course, Babylon is the place from which this sprang, the fragmentation of the nations. So Beale and McDonough write, the phrase fallen, fallen is Babylon derives from Isaiah 21, and it is equivalent to the ensuing statement that the idols of Babylon are destroyed. The destruction of the idolatrous system of the world is also in mind here, as chapter 13 and the immediately following verses in 14:9 and 11 bear out. The Isaiah allusion is merged with another Old Testament reference. So they're saying there's also another passage we could look at here. The title Babylon the Great is based on the identical name of the city in Daniel 4:30, specifically reading with the Septuagint, the Greek there, to match John's Greek. In Daniel 4, the name forms part of an expression of the king's self-glorification for which he is about to be judged. Now in Revelation 14:8, the latter-day Babylon meets its end. So, it's a judgment of the Babel chaos. It's a judgment of the gods of the nations, in a more final sort of sense, because of John's hearkening back to Isaiah 21. He loops that into this day of the Lord judgment here, again, to communicate the idea that not only are the gods of the nations going to be judged, but all of the nations should worship Yahweh. Again, so there's this notion of, the Great Commission being accomplished. This is, fullness of the Gentiles content. These are concepts that you would associate with the fullness of the Gentiles, that the nations, again, those among the nations who are going to follow the Lord are being brought back into the family. Everything's wrapping up. The wicked are going to be judged. Babylon, the whole system is going to be judged. And that's why it's good news. Interestingly enough, John does use euangelion, which elsewhere in the New Testament is the gospel. So again, it's like the gospel gets its culmination in terms of the nations when the day of the Lord happens and the gods are judged, the nations are judged, and the righteous are vindicated. Again, this is all, sort of these are parts of a coherent whole. And John is, dipping into the Old Testament to, articulate this. Now, John, in his own context, is almost certainly using Babylon, the name Babylon, as a cipher for Rome, because that's where the chaos system in his day is being run, through. Rome it's the fourth kingdom of Daniel. Okay, Rome is the great world empire that has inherited dominion from the original Babylon of Daniel's own day, his personal day when he actually lived. So they become, again, the latest iteration for what the problem is, what this whole system is. And again, it's not a coincidence that when you go back to Daniel 2, for instance, when the kingdom made without hands rolls into the image, and shatters, the image, and of course it strikes, the feet, which is the fourth kingdom. And this kingdom made without hands is the kingdom of God. Well, it's during the inauguration of the kingdom of God, i.e. the time of the New Testament, i.e. the time of Jesus and his work, that the kingdom is begun. And so the shattering of the Babel system is not completely taken care of, but its demise is now in progress. Again, this is the already but not yet, sort of thing that you see going on in the New Testament. And so in John's vision of the future, this is, again, the way it's gonna play out. This is the way it's going to end. The system as it is going to be completely done away with. The gods are going to be judged and so on and so forth. But in John's day, the representative earthly power for the older Babylonian chaos system is Rome. And this is why you get Babel or Babylon used in not just the New Testament, but in other literature as a reference to Rome. I mean, this does happen in other writers. So Beale and McDonough note in this regard, they say, just as Babylon destroyed the first temple, Solomon's temple, and sent Israel into exile, so Rome came to be called Babylon in some sectors of Judaism, because it also destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and exiled Israel, again, all over again. And they note a few references in the Midrash Rabbah, Numbers 7:10, Psalm 137:8. In fact, they continue, contemporary and later Jewish sources equated the name Babylon with Rome explicitly. And there's a whole string of references here. I'll just give you a few. 2 Baruch 11:1, 33:2, 67:7, 79:1. The Sibylline Oracles 5, 140 to 143, and 158 through 161. 1 Peter 5:13, again in the New Testament. Midrash Rabbah for Leviticus 6:6, and the Song of Solomon 6, or 1:6. Even some Dead Sea Scrolls, the Habakkuk Pesher, 1QP Habakkuk, does the same thing, uses Babylon for Rome. So Babylon is a symbolic name for Rome, just generally. They point out here, especially in 4th Ezra 3:2 and 31, and 4th Ezra 12, 10 through 39, where the metaphor of the eagle for Babylon, specifically from Daniel 7:4, is applied to Rome as the fourth kingdom. So Jews, that's the end of their quotation. So Jews in the first century context, the Second Temple Jewish context, were using Babylon very specifically for Rome. And some of them even go as far as to name Rome as the fourth kingdom of Daniel 7, which, we're sort of used to that because, we look in hindsight at the flow of ancient history and Babylon, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks and then the Romans. Okay. So they were thinking along the same lines way back then. Owen in his commentary, again, has something to note here as well. He says, as a cipher for Rome, the term Babylon occurs occasionally in Jewish apocalyptic literature, though the fact that all the references occur in literature, all the references that do this occur in literature that post-dates AD 70, which is the year when Jerusalem fell to Titus. And this has suggested to many scholars that the equation of Babylon and Rome was not made until after that date, after 70 AD. And that suggests that Revelation must have been written after that date. In other words, after 70 AD. And, he cites some people here, some familiar names to this podcast. Adela Yarbrough Collins, for instance, notes this and, takes this view. And this is common. This is one of the proof texts or the arguments for the late date of Revelation, which anybody who's not a preterist, either a full or a partial preterist, that this is what they prefer, that Revelation is written in the 90s or something like that. So this is one of the big arguments. Owen continues, there were other symbolic names for Rome in use by early Judaism, including Edom. Again, that makes sense because Edom assisted Babylon. Remember our series on Obadiah. That's really what Obadiah is about. Back to Owen, he says, so we have Edom, we have Kittim, or either in Hebrew or Aramaic. The Kittim in Daniel 11:30 is translated. This is interesting in the Septuagint, Kittim, which means Westerners. Okay, in Daniel 11:30, the Septuagint actually translates that as Romans. In Daniel 11:30, so it's a very clear equivalence. Egypt is also used as a cipher for Rome. So there are these other names, again, that sort of are used for Rome, but they harken back again to this, who the mega oppressor was and is, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of this kind of thing going on, but it's very common, again, to use Babylon itself instead of Edom or Kittim or Egypt for Rome. Really, the concept is kind of the same no matter what you're really looking at. Owen, though, is honest, and he says, look, this isn't a slam dunk for a post-70 AD authorship, though. So he writes, the argument that Babylon as a code word for Rome pointed to a date after 70 AD for the composition of Revelation is vulnerable, since the name Babylon is used to interpret Assyria in Isaiah 10:13 through 19, part of an oracle against Assyria in Isaiah 10. In the Pesher commentary 4QP Isaiah C. So in English, there were whoever wrote the Pesher among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a Pesher is a commentary. So the people at Qumran were writing commentaries. We call them Peshers because they use the phrase Pishro, this means, okay, in their commentary of whatever biblical book we're talking about here. So in one of the commentaries, one of the Peshers to Isaiah found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Babylon is also used to talk about Assyria. So there's not, it's not a consistent usage. So you can't really say that Babylon is only used, for Rome. It could be used for other things. And so since this is in a Dead Sea Scroll, the use of Babylon as a code word, just generally, period, the use of Babylon as a code word, the technique can be dated before 70 AD. So those who would favor preterism, full or partial, preterist would use examples like this and say, look, you can't argue that Babylon is only used as a code term after 70 AD. It's used as a code term before 70 AD. Here you have this one example. Of course, the rebuttal to this is that, well, that early one isn't used of Rome, is it? No. Well, back in 100 BC, that Rome wouldn't have been the issue. So this is how the argument goes back and forth. And we're not doing eschatological systems arguments here, but since this verse and its reference to Babylon and the whole Rome issue is so commonly known by students who study prophecy and Revelation, I thought I'd mention it. But it's not a slam dunk either way. Let's move on to Revelation 14:10 and 11. Revelation 14:10 and 11. Let me read those real quickly again. The one who takes the mark of the beast, he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. So you look at that description, the suffering of the beast and those loyal to the beast are characterized as drinking the wine of God's wrath, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. So Beale and McDonough have a few comments on this, and they say, the picture of pouring out wine resulting in intoxication indicates the unleashing of God's wrath at the final judgment. And they give a string of Old Testament verses for that. Just a couple: Psalm 60, verse 3, Psalm 75, 8, Isaiah 51, 17, 51, 21 through 23, so on and so forth. It's a fairly long list. This imagery is inspired especially by the wording of Psalm 75, 8, and Jeremiah 25, 15, and Jeremiah 51, 7 in particular, all three of which are grouped together and applied by Jewish exegetical tradition to the wicked who will, quote, drink in the time to come, unquote. And that's from the Midrash Rabbah of Genesis, or Midrash Rabbah in Genesis 88:5, and Midrash of Psalm 11:5 and Psalm 75:4. So there was an apocalyptic belief, McDonough and Beale continue, that the wicked would be punished, often by fire, in the presence of the righteous. 1 Enoch 48:9, 1 Enoch 62:12, 1 Enoch 108:14 and 15. Then you have a few references in Wisdom of Solomon, Ezra, 4th Ezra, so on and so forth. So this was a common idea. And part of it comes from Isaiah 66:22 through 24. And how do we handle this? I mean, on the one instance, you could look at the passage and say, well, this is for the followers of the beast. This is, these are these people that are going to live in the future or whatever, that follow the beast and so on and so forth. Remember when we talked about the beast, that the mark is really, whether it's physical or not, and we don't really know. I mean, the wording suggests something going on like this, but there's no precedent really for this branding idea. We talked about how believers, Jews and then believers, bear the name, again, metaphorically, and how this same language is used of the beast. Those who follow the beast bear the name, okay? Because the mark is the name of the beast, all right? So whatever this number is, whatever the mark is, it's the name of the beast, and they bear it, they take it. Just like in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the idea of bearing the name isn't literal. It's metaphorical. It's, this language conveys alignment. Whose side are you on? Who do you follow? Where is your allegiance? And so those who are, in allegiance with the beast, those who reject Christ, you could expand it and say, well, it's not just these people in the future, because they're going to be punished and so on and so forth. So obviously this goes into the hell versus annihilation discussion. If you want to be real technical about it, the language, would pertain to people in the future, because it's tied in with the beast. It's tied in with the time of these apocalyptic events happening. So that's would be an argument that the annihilationist would make and say, look, it's not literal anyway, just like the mark's not literal, so annihilation's okay. And even if it wasn't, it's a special subset group, the people who are allied with the Antichrist at the time of the end. That's not just, lost people now and blah, 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 so on and so forth. I mean, you can see how, the other side would just say, well, it's anybody who's not belonging to Christ, and that's the end of the story. So this is how the two sides of that debate, the hell debate, will take Revelation 14:11. So you've got a metaphorical versus literal argument. You've got if this is all future language versus no, it's not argument in relation to that debate. But the language itself comes, again, from these other texts, both Second Temple texts and some Old Testament texts as well, that are prophecies, okay, that are looking forward into, what is still to us, still future, as far as the ultimate judgment, the day of the Lord, and so on and so forth. So the verse, it really isn't that much help, to nail down the everlasting torment versus annihilation question, because it is put in an apocalyptic setting. So you can make an argument either way, but it's not as clear-cut as you would think, is the point I'm trying to make, because it does have these Old Testament contexts. And if we went back to and looked at Enoch, 1 Enoch 27, 2 and 3 is another reference where you get this language, 1 Enoch 48. These references, even in Enoch, which is where you get the lake of fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, that New Testament comment in Matthew 25, that comes from the book of Enoch. It's not found anywhere else. Even in that text, that book, 1 Enoch is an apocalypse. It's a vision of the future. So even that's not really helpful. Even though it was written before Revelation, it's an apocalypse. It's just like the book of Revelation is, that the end is coming, the wicked are doomed, the Messiah is going to come and judge everybody. That's what 1 Enoch is. That's what the whole book is about. It spends time on the watchers because this is why we deserve condemnation, because we're depraved and corrupt, and we have our own selves to blame for this, and we especially have, the watchers to blame for this, the proliferation of depravity thing. Basically it explains why God would bother judging the world. And the answer is because it's a terrible place. And we have only ourselves and these supernatural beings that hate us to blame. So that's it. That's 1 Enoch. It's an apocalyptic text. And again, just wanted to rabbit trail a little bit off into that because, again, this is a common verse that lots of people know, but it does have, again, a specific Old Testament apocalyptic context. It has Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic context. And of course, we're in the book of Revelation, which is an apocalypse. So, how much does it really help address a full orb theology of personal eschatology? It could go either way, just like all this other stuff. And again, in Q&A sessions, I've been asked a couple times about, hell and annihilation. That to me, both views are on the table. And this is another reason why, the language can be, it can lead you in different directions, the very same language. So let's go to Revelation 14 through 20. And let's read that real quickly. This is to the end of the chapter. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle, and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven. He too had a sharp sickle, and another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth, and gathered the grape harvest of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia, which my little ESV note says about 184 miles. A stadia, stadion, singular, was about 607 feet, or 185 meters. So it's quite a distance. What about this? So, verse 14, we have this description of one like a son of man. So right away that grabs your attention, and it raises the question, should the one like a son of man here in this verse, Revelation 14:14, be identified with Christ or an angel? And does the harvest represent judgment or salvation? Obviously one like a son of man, this could be a reference to the Son of Man. But since angels also appear as men in the Old Testament, for instance, Genesis 18 and 19, specifically Genesis 19:1, Daniel 10:16, since angels can appear as men and do, maybe the one like a son of man refers to an angel. So is it the Son of Man, or is it just an angel? Now On again chimes in on the issue here. He says the unusual image of the one like the Son of Man sitting on a cloud in this verse may preserve allusions to the earlier combination of Psalm 110 with Daniel 7:13, such as that found in Mark 14:62. I'm going to read Mark 14:62, just so you know what he's angling for here. Jesus said, again, this is part of the scene where he's on trial with before Caiaphas. Jesus said, I am. Let me go back. He asked, are you Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So there you have a seated element, and then you have the coming with the clouds of heaven element. Well, how can you be seated and coming at the same time? Well, it's not meant to describe something that you could draw, and I guess sort of make a cartoon out of it or something. The language here denotes two separate things, both of which are messianic, and you caught it in On's quotation. So On is saying the seating element, sitting on a cloud, here in Revelation 14:14, combines sitting in the clouds, just like Mark 14:62 combines sitting in the clouds, and Matthew 26:64 does it too. Why? Because it's merging Psalm 110:1 with Daniel 7:13. Now, Daniel 7:13 we already know about, Son of Man coming with or upon the clouds. Psalm 110:1, and let's read it. It's Psalm 110. It's a very overtly messianic psalm. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So this is the Messiah sitting essentially on the throne of power, the right hand, the throne of power. And that's what Jesus actually alludes to when he quotes this in front of Caiaphas. So it's not just Daniel 7:13. There's a Psalm 110 element in here too. So this very well could be the Son of Man, i.e. Christ, the Messiah. And you say, why are we spending time on this? Well, just hang on in a second and I'll let you know. I mean, you probably already get a sense of it if you just read through the passage or remember the passage. There's also part of the debate revolves around the word another. So in verse 15, let's go back to Revelation 14, verse 15. So we're trying to identify who the one like a Son of Man is in verse 14. Is it Christ, or is it an angel? And then we get verse 15, and another angel. So that makes it sound like we should take a Son of Man, one like a Son of Man, and think it's an angel. Verse 15, we get another one. So On says, there's also this word here that's part of what's going on. And he writes, the adjective allos, another, suggests that the figure just referred to in verse 14 as a Son of Man is an angelic figure and therefore reflects a Jewish perspective. But it is hardly likely, he's going to object to this now, it is hardly likely that the final editor of Revelation would have demoted the Son of Man in verse 14 to an angel because of all the way he's talked about the Son of Man earlier. Chapter 1. It's very clear Ancient of Days imagery is merged into the Son of Man imagery and used of Christ. So On saying, yes, it really isn't. Would John really demote him to angelic status here? And he writes that this other angel emerges from the heavenly temple implies the divine authorization of his command to the one sitting on the cloud to begin the harvest. So in other words, if you go back to verses 14 and 15, what On is suggesting is we have two figures. We have this one like a Son of Man with a golden crown on his head, sharp sickle in his hand, and then another angel comes out of the temple. Well, we've already had angels in this chapter and in previous chapters. So we get another one coming out of heaven, and specifically, the temple in heaven, okay? And so this other angel comes to the Son of Man and then calls with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, the Son of Man, put in your sickle and reap. Now, this raises another issue. Do we have an angel commanding Jesus? Okay. Well, On says, no, this really isn't the case. I mean, I think I'll quote Beale here because I think Beale does a little bit, more with this. But essentially, the angel isn't commanding Jesus. He's coming out of the heavenly temple and he's announcing that God has now authorized Christ's return in judgment. Remember back in the Gospels when the disciples are asking Jesus about the day or hour, when is all this stuff going to happen? And Jesus says, well, it's not for anybody to know the day or hour except the Father. Here's when the Father says, it's time. Go out, go back, and put in your sickle. So he sends the angel to tell the Son of Man, now is the time. Now, that's all we have here. We don't have an angel commanding Jesus, like Jesus is waiting for the angel to order him. No, he's waiting for God's determination that now is the time. And so God sends forth an angel and says, go tell the Son of Man that here we go. It's time. It's time to wrap this up. So Beale in his commentary says, including the Son of Man, there are 7 heavenly beings in Revelation 14, 6 through 20. On this basis, some have concluded that the Son of Man is an angel since the other beings are called angels. And he performs the function performed by an angel in verses 17 to 18. Beale says, well, this is possible. And again, before you wonder about that, remember in earlier episodes we've talked about angelomorphic Christology. Okay, so this is part of the two powers motif going on in ancient Judaism. That God can come as an angel. Remember the Old Testament? Yahweh is the angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord isn't. He is, but isn't Yahweh. It's the same thing going on here. So Beale says, okay, this is possible. But he says, it's not a necessary conclusion since the Son of Man is not identified as an angel. And in Revelation 1:7, Revelation 1:13 and 20, those passages clearly portray the Son of Man from Daniel 7 as the divine Christ with precisely the same wording as used here. Furthermore, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds in the synoptic eschatological discourses and elsewhere is always Christ. Now catch that point. The Son of Man everywhere else, when it comes to the descriptions of returning in judgment, it's always Christ. So why would we say it's not Christ here? When there's a perfectly understandable way of taking another angel, basically to be another angel, other than the ones who've already shown up in this chapter and in the earlier chapters. There's no reason to relegate Jesus to an angel here. But Beale says, look, if you want to do that, okay, but you got to remember, hey, there's Old Testament precedent for Yahweh being an angel. Okay, let's not forget that. And typically people who want to be, make a Unitarian argument or Jehovah's Witnesses or somebody like this, they forget about all that stuff. And also they're not really informed about how in Judaism God can show up as an angel, just in other Jewish texts, because those other Jewish texts are well aware of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the angel of the Lord, stuff in the Hebrew Bible. Anyway, so Beale says, look, all the other places in the same eschatological context, Day of the Lord, they're all Christ. He writes later and says, another angel now appears and issues a command to the Son of Man. If the Son of Man in verse 14 is the Messiah, then Allos, another, sets this angel alongside the 3 angels in verses 6 through 9. But if verse 14 pictures an angelic being, Allos places the angel also alongside the Son of Man figure. The angel's command could suggest that he has authority over the Son of Man, who is therefore subordinate to the angel, but probably only a functional subordination to God is in mind. This is what we talked about earlier. So that's the end of the Beale quote. So rather than having the angel command Jesus, what you have is the angel is sent by God to tell Jesus, the Son of Man, now is the time. That's the more consistent way to look at the language here. Let's move on to verses 17 through 20. And we have this sickle imagery. This is drawn, that's part of the imagery here in verses 17 through 20. It's drawn from the Old Testament. Specifically, Joel 3:13 seems to be an important passage here. So let me quote that here. Let me look that up real quickly. Joel 3:13. And again, this is Day of the Lord stuff. Back, if you go up to verse 11, hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, gather yourselves here. This is the showdown of Armageddon, when Jerusalem is surrounded by the nations. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Remember we haven't gotten there yet, but you all know the passage in Revelation where the Lord returns with the heavenly host. So Joel says, "Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Let the nations stir themselves up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their evil is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision." So this is very clearly, day of the Lord language. And it also helps us answer the question, is the sickle a harvest of redemption or is it judgment of the wicked? It's pretty clearly judgment of the wicked, again, fitting in with all this other day of the Lord imagery. So Joel 3:13 is an important passage for this. Other than that passage, harvesting, that terminology can refer to judgment. You have Jeremiah 51:33, Micah 4:12 through 13. Matthew 3:12 and Luke 3:17 actually utilizes those passages. And on notes, the gathering of the vintage is itself a metaphor for eschatological judgment, while the emphasis on the winepress in verse 19 is a second metaphor for judgment. The vintage harvest and the winepress as metaphors for divine judgment are found both of them in Joel 3:13. Another little item from here in verses 17 through 20, we have reference to an angel having authority over fire. Okay, let's go back to Revelation 14. And if we look here, it refers to verse 18. Another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire. What's going on with that? So on notes, according to Jewish tradition, various angels had authority over various aspects of the world, including the four winds. Revelation 7:1 actually alludes to that. The abyss, we've already seen that dude, Revelation 9:11. And the waters, Revelation 16:5. According to the Testament of Abraham, Recension A 13:10. Again, this is a pseudepigraphical text from the Second Temple Jewish period. According to the Testament of Abraham, we read this: Pur-uel, that's P-U-R, Pur is the Greek word for fire, okay? Pur-uel is the archangel who has authority over fire, the fire of God. This angel is referred to earlier as the fiery angel who held the fire, also in Testament of Abraham, Recension A 12:14, and whose task it is to test the works of people by fire. The notion that angels were created out of the fire was widespread in early Judaism, based on Psalm 104:4. Psalm 104:4, I'll read that to you. This is where the psalmist says that he, God, makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. Now, the verse doesn't really say that they're made out of fire, but you can see how early Judaism, would have taken that wording and come up with this idea. And it's actually a fairly ubiquitous idea. You've got Jubilees 2:2, Second Apocalypse of Baruch 21:6, 48:8, Second Enoch 39:5. Apocalypse of Abraham 19:6. I mean, there's a bunch of these. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls 1QH 1:10 through 11. This is a common idea, but back earlier to what's actually in the verse, because we're not talking about the origin of angels here. That's not the context. We have this angel who is has authority over the fire, and what On is suggesting is the way to understand this is that we've got an assistant here, assisting the Messiah, assisting Christ when Christ lays the sickle into the earth and we judges the wicked. That we have an assistant standing nearby, the angel with authority over fire, who's going to test their works by fire. So this is how that idea, which is common in the Old Testament, this is how that idea sort of works itself out in eschatological thought. Again, all of this is a way of saying God is going to know what your destiny is rightfully going to be. There will be no ambiguity. If you just think about it. If you've borne the mark of the beast, you've aligned yourself with the beast, guess what? Your works ain't doing you any good. Don't claim that they're going to do you any good. Okay, they're just going to burn up. There's nothing there on which to resist the verdict that you have aligned yourself with evil, and your destiny now is destruction. Great winepress of the wrath of God on writes this. This clause, this specific phrase, idea here, is an allusion to Isaiah 63, 1 through 6, which depicts the Lord as the divine warrior coming with garments stained with the blood of his enemies, compared with the garments of one who treads grapes in the winepress. The identity of the one who treads the winepress is also not made clear. However, in 1915, Revelation 19:15, it is the rider on the white horse, in other words, the exalted Christ, returning with his heavenly armies in judgment, who treads the grapes in the winepress of God's wrath. I'm going to go to Isaiah 63. This is sort of a well-known passage in Isaiah. We have Isaiah 63, and let's just start. We'll start at the beginning. Who is this who comes from Edom, in crimson garments from Bozrah? He who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. So again, this passage begins this way, and this is going to be a day of the Lord passage. And Edom, of course, and Bozrah, I mean, Edom, again, gets, it's not a code word, but when you see Edom in eschatological passages, it is an oblique reference to Babylon, because Edom and Babylon were partners in destroying Jerusalem. Okay, again, back to our series on the book of Obadiah. So Isaiah continues and says, why is your apparel red, and your garments like his who treads in the winepress? And the answer comes, I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Now, even in that passage, we don't get a clear reference that the one treading the winepress is God himself. So maybe this is, a sort of a messianic thing, because John certainly takes it that way. I mean, John's use of this in Revelation, he's going to attribute this to Christ. Okay, the one who, has the sickle, the sharp sickle. That's verse 18. He called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, which is the Son of Man. So, I'll just make this reference, because I think I've used this article before, and it's probably in the protected folder, but Tremper Longman, who is an Old Testament scholar of wide repute, he's well known. We've interviewed him for the podcast before, when we were at SBL. Tremper used to teach at Westminster, and he teaches at Westmont, California. I think he's still active. I'm not sure. He might be retired at this point. But he has a really nice article on Day of the Lord, divine warrior imagery from the Old Testament used of Jesus. Okay, so we need to remember this. Jesus does not come back blowing kisses. Okay, when the Messiah returns, all of the contexts are apocalyptic and cast in terms of divine warrior judgment stuff. And this is another one. So by virtue of John doing this, he's telling you who he thinks the wine treader, back in Isaiah 63 is. And if other people want to say he's God, well, John would be okay with that, because Jesus is God anyway. It's one of these things where there's an oblique reference to this character, this figure in the Old Testament. And in John's mind, this is the Lord. The Lord is the divine warrior. And the divine warrior in the Old Testament, there's only one of those. It's God, or, surprise, surprise, the angel of the Lord. The captain of the Lord's host. The captain, of the Lord's host would be the Lord of the hosts, and so on and so forth. All these ideas, fit together. This is a matrix of ideas. And it's fundamentally understandable if you understand the two Yahwehs idea. Yahweh invisible and transcendent, Yahweh appearing as a man. And the key figure is going to be the angel, who is the captain of the Lord's host from Joshua 5, because of the phrase, the drawn sword in his hand, occurs only two other places in the Old Testament, Numbers 22, 1 Chronicles 21, and both of those are specifically and explicitly identified as the angel of the Lord. So, John is aware of all this, and he inserts Christ. It's Jesus to him. All of this stuff is Christ, all of this imagery. And so it tells you something about John's Christology. He views Jesus, he views the Son of Man. I mean, for goodness sake, in Revelation 1, he used Ancient of Days language to describe the Son of Man. The Son of Man is God in human form, Christ. Again, this tells you something theologically. It's not just, icky stuff that's, makes us wonder about prophecy or wars or something like that. I mean, don't miss the Christology here. In verse 20, to wrap up here, we have this line, blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia, or as the ESV footnote said, 184 miles. Now, On writes, Bauckham has shown that this hyperbole, he's taking it as a hyperbole, and I would agree with that, consisting of an extraordinary amount of blood indicating a slaughter of exceptional proportions, is a topos. That's a literary term. It's actually a term from rhetoric. A topos is a stock rhetorical formula or technique, such as examples would be puns or proverbs, to convey certain ideas very specifically. It's a technique. It's a topos technique frequently found in ancient literature. The earliest occurrence of this particular topos, this particular rhetorical strategy, is found in 1 Enoch 100, verse 3. And this is from the Charlesworth volume, the translation here of Enoch. And the horse will walk up to its chest in the blood of sinners, unquote. So he's saying this is the earliest example of this kind of thing. Josephus historicizes this topos, this notion of not rivers of blood, but like a small ocean of blood, okay? That's the topos, that's the technique. Josephus historicizes this topos by referring to the many Jews killed by Romans when Jerusalem was captured in AD 70. This is in the Jewish Wars 6.406. Josephus describes the number of corpses, quote, deluged, that's a term for flooding, okay, deluged the whole city with blood to such an extent that many fires were extinguished by the gory stream, unquote. Now, again, there's no evidence from any other Jewish writer that this literally happened. It's a way of expressing the magnitude of death. And in Revelation 14:20, it's a way of expressing the magnitude of the judgment. That's all it's trying to do. So On says, to wrap up here, the inclusion of the mention of the horses' bridles in this apocalyptic hyperbole indicates that the author in Revelation 19:11 through 21, which again is the Armageddon event, is alluding to a decisive eschatological battle. Okay, that's the whole point. It is decisive. It is comprehensive. It is the magnitude of it is hard to express. And so again, this topos, this rhetorical technique, is used about blood being as high as a horse's bridle. You can find that phrasing, that idea elsewhere, when it's clearly not supposed to be literal, but express again this idea that you just can't believe, this how huge, the magnitude of this event. Yeah, Revelation 15 and 16, because there's a lot of overlap here. And to some extent, there's been overlap with parts of both chapters in earlier chapters. So it's workable to take these two in tandem. And they cover the 7 bowl judgments, just generally anyway. So let's just jump in here a little bit. I'm going to go to Revelation 15. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but just enough to get us started here. Revelation 15 is pretty short. I'll read that and then talk a little bit about chapter 15, and then we'll jump into 16. So again, reading ESV, Revelation 15 says, Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last. For with them the wrath of God is finished. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying,
Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. After this, I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. And out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, with golden sashes around their chests. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls, full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the sanctuary was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. So that's Revelation 15, again, pretty short. And it opens with these 7 angels who are going to unleash 7 plagues, the bowl judgments. And we see these 7 angels later, of course, in chapter 16. That's when we're going to get the actual bowl judgments spelled out. We also get a reference to them in 17:1 because, the last bowl judgment is going to, all of the bowl judgments, but especially the last, it is going to set up the fall of Babylon. And so we again get a reference to these 7 angels in chapter 17, because chapter 17 and 18 really deal with the fall of Babylon. So we have 7 angels. Again, we've seen this number of angels before, and like I just said, we'll see it again. What I want to focus on, though, is, since we've covered a lot of the 7 angel territory, is the sea of glass. Let's just start there. This is actually an Old Testament allusion, even though you would wonder, well, where have I seen a sea of glass before, other than, maybe the book of Revelation, certain language that lends itself to that. Beale and McDonough summarize it this way. They say, the sight of what appeared to be like a sea of glass, like crystal, could include allusion to the reflection of the laver in Solomon's temple and the heavenly splendor of God's holy separateness. But uppermost in mind is the heavenly analog to the Red Sea in connection with the new Exodus. This identification is confirmed beyond doubt by the following mention of the new Song of Moses, which is the latter-day counterpart of Moses' song recounted in Exodus 15. The Exodus atmosphere is discernible through the prior mention of plagues, that's chapter 15, verse 1, which clearly are modeled after the plagues of Egypt, and we're going to see that in chapter 16. And by the subsequent mention of the tabernacle of testimony in verse 5. The first exodus out of Egypt and out from under Pharaoh's tyrannical power will be recapitulated by divine design in a final end-time exodus of God's people out from under the tyrannical oppression and rule of the beast over the world. So that's a paragraph of summary. I think it's a pretty good summary, because since it's going to be very clear that you have Exodus plague imagery with the bowls, and you've got the Song of Moses specifically mentioned, what we have here with, the sea language, again, is analogous to the deliverance of the Red Sea. So we have the deliverance of the Red Sea back in the Old Testament, where God's people are delivered from, at the time, what was the primary chaos agent of the Old Testament, ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt was, again, holding God's people hostage in Egypt. Of course, Pharaoh eventually tries to exterminate them. All that serves an analogy for John when it comes to the beast. Now, the beast is bigger and wider and badder and all those things. But again, he sees an analogy to the beast, and specifically, he's going to analogize the beast not only to Egypt here, but we've already seen him do it, and we're going to see him do it. He's going to analogize it to Babylon. Babylon becomes, after Egypt, the primary chaos agent, the primary anti-Eden agent, the primary threat to the existence of the people of God and the survival of the covenants, really the restoration of Eden. Babylon is the primary threat to that as the Old Testament comes to a close, which is why, again, here, as John's looking, forward, into what awaits the church, the looming threat and darkness, he's going to portray that threat and the beast and his power with Babel and with Egypt. I mean, it makes sense. This is how you communicate the idea not only the idea of who they are, but what God is going to do and who's actually going to win here. Now, there are other Old Testament allusions to the sea and the crystal, language, the sea of glass, that kind of thing. Ezekiel 121 is probably the more obvious in terms of the specific language, where you have the firmament in Ezekiel 121, which is the crystal platform for God's throne. Yeah, and that's important because we have to remember what the context for Revelation 15 is. This is still part of that divine council meeting that we were launched into in Revelation 4 and 5. Where the judgments of God and the Lamb are going to be described and meted out. All of this is taking place, again, in the divine council context. And so, of course, we would get this image associated with the throne of God, because in Ezekiel 1, we have the same image with God's throne, the wheels and the fire, and you get the firmament, again, with the cherubim and all this. And we've seen all of these elements from Ezekiel 1 elsewhere in the book of Revelation 4 and 5 being most prominent. So we shouldn't be surprised to see it picked up again here, sort of as a cue for readers, again, to reorient ourselves back into the actual scene where this is taking place. So Beale observes that, but he also loops in Daniel 7 along with Ezekiel 1 and Exodus 15 in his comments about the sea of glass mentioned in Revelation 4:6. So if we go back and look at what he said there, he's going to describe the relationship of this scene and this language to the divine council decision of Daniel 7, specifically 7:10, and that involves the judgment of the fourth beast, whose body was given to be burnt with fire, and that's Daniel 7:11. So Beale writes, the sea is also associated with the idea of evil. Yeah, that's familiar to us. Caird, who was a well-known New Testament scholar, has argued that here it connotes cosmic evil, since it often has such nuance in the Old Testament and sometimes elsewhere in Revelation. And he notes Revelation 13:1, 21:1, and especially 15:2, as well as the abyss in 11:7. This speculation receives support from the modeling of these chapters on Daniel 7, since the sea as a picture of the beast's origin is a significant feature in Daniel 7. And the scenes of Daniel 7 and Ezekiel 1, of course, have integral literary links. The former is usually seen as dependent on the latter. The portrayal of the Red Sea in the Old Testament as the abode of the evil sea monster, again, this is Leviathan imagery, confirms that this setting is also included in John's thought. And he notes, he recommends comparing Isaiah 51:9 through 11 and Psalm 74:12 through 15 and Ezekiel 32:2. Psalm 74 is one that we've referenced here on the podcast a number of times about Leviathan imagery that's tied to the crossing of the Red Sea. So Beale continues, in view of the Daniel and Exodus imagery, there is then a hint that John sees the chaotic powers of the sea as calmed by divine sovereignty. Revelation 5:5 and following reveals that Christ's overcoming through his death and resurrection is what defeated the power of evil and so calmed Satan's watery, tumultuous abode, again, the abyss. Revelation 4:6 gives a picture of the stilling of the hellish waters from the heavenly perspective, though the devil displays his wrath even more furiously on earth because he has been decisively defeated in heaven. That's Revelation 12, he gives a side nod to. When John later says that there is no longer any sea, again, the sea is no more, Revelation 21:1, he means that all evil on the earth will not only be defeated, but also eradicated when Christ's kingdom is established consummately on earth. In fact, the sea of glass like crystal before the throne in 4:6 may be an intentional contrast with a river, with the phrase, a river of the water of life clear as crystal coming from the throne in Revelation 22:1. So what Beale is suggesting here is that the sea here might be both a metaphor or a symbol of satanic evil, the power of the beast, because he comes from the sea and all these other allusions here. But also it's still the throne of God, because God is the victor over chaos. So he's saying it's a symbol or an image that can do double duty. both, again, the thing that's the threat, the symbol of the threat and the origin of the beast, but also, just like back in the Old Testament, the Red Sea was, when they're standing there at the Red Sea, they're thinking we're going to die. And the sea is a metaphor for chaos. But God subdues, divides, parts the waters. He is in control. He dominates chaos at the Exodus event. And so that would be what John is trying to convey here, that despite all the stuff that he said about the beast up to this point, and the terribleness of what's going on earth, it's the Lord that's going to dominate the beast. The Lord is going to win the day. So again, he's using this imagery to convey these thoughts. So again, the point for Revelation 15 in these observations from Beale and others is that you have God's throne resting atop, the sea of glass. Again, if it is tied to Ezekiel 1, and it's pretty hard to see how it couldn't be. Just like Ezekiel 1 was a declaration of God's sovereignty. Yeah, we're sitting here in Babylon, but you get the cherubim with the four faces, the four cardinal points of the zodiac, and God is still king over time and history, the movement of time, the epochs of time. He knows where history is going. He's in control of it. All these things are again brought to bear in Revelation 15 as we lead up to the final set of 7 judgments, the bowl judgments, and the collapse, the defeat of the beast, and his empire. So if we move to, let's move to verses 5 through 8, Revelation 15. We have just a few comments here. The attire of the angels, again, how they're dressed, is obviously drawn from Levitical priestly garments. We could see that from Ezekiel 9, 2 and 3, Ezekiel 9, 11, Ezekiel 10, 2, Daniel 10, 5, Daniel 12, 6 and 7. And we, just to harken back to earlier episodes, there was this notion about how maybe the 144,000, because of the way they're dressed, Levitically, and also the comment that they have not defiled themselves with women, maybe they are sort of a priestly class that symbolically represents the antithesis of the Watchers, and again, they're the chaos they're going to spawn on Earth at their release, from the abyss. So some of that could be in play here too. So we don't want to forget that. Bowls, moving on from the clothes, bowls are also used in the Old Testament inside the sanctuary, inside the tabernacle and the temple. And On, in his Revelation commentary, has a few brief comments about this. He says, the word phiale, usually translated bowl, must be understood as a cultic utensil. In other words, it's an object used in ritual service, priestly service. And he says it should therefore be translated bowl used in offerings. And he references BDAG, the main lexicon for that idea. So because if translators chose to do that, it would preserve the ritual feel to it as opposed to just bowl. Because we think of cereal bowls or something, but it's a little more specific in that in context. And Owen says these libation bowls are mentioned 12 times in Revelation. I'm not going to give you the grocery list. You could look that up and concord it. But they're mentioned a lot. And again, a lot of the places really up to Revelation 21:9 in the list that Owen gives of these 12 times, most of them are going to be in passages that have the heavenly tabernacle, i.e. the throne of God, i.e. the divine council throne room in view. So again, the ritual angle is definitely worth pursuing and observing. So the bowls then are cast as ritual objects. What were they used for? Again, if you use the Old Testament analogy, the bowls there were probably used to carry out the ashes and fat of sacrifices from sacred space. And if that's the case, the symbolism would likely be that the earth is about to be purified by removing defilement. The earth is going to be sanctified. It's going to be made ready for the reoccupation of the Messiah, because what follows is the decimation of the beast. And the next image we run into is the sanctuary filling with smoke. This is going to bring us to the end of chapter 15. And that reinforces this, again, Levitical ritual idea for these other vessels, these other instruments. Beale and McDonough note this. They say God's presence in the temple is highlighted as it is quote, filled with the smoke of God's glory and from his power, unquote, which is language that you'll find also in Exodus 40, verses 34 and 35, 1 Kings 8, the prayer for the temple that Solomon builds, 1 Kings 8, 10 through 11, 2 Chronicles 5, 13, Isaiah 6, 1 and 4, especially in the Septuagint. Again, those references, especially in the Septuagint. And they continue by saying the description may be a collective echo of similar Old Testament descriptions of God's presence in the earthly temple, though the focus may be more on Ezekiel 10, 2 through 4, where an angelic being, quote, clothed with linen, unquote, stands close to the 4 cherubim in the heavenly temple, and, quote, the temple was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord, unquote. The Ezekiel 10 scene is an introduction to an announcement of judgment, which brings it even closer to the function of the similar vision in Revelation 15, so that the former becomes analogous to the latter. Again, you've still got the judgment context. You've got the purification of not the heavenly tabernacle temple here, but the earth. Again, the idea being conveyed by the priestly garments, the bowls. Again, ritual service. The earth is being prepared for the reoccupation of the Messiah. In other words, it's being prepared to once again become sacred space. We're removing defilement. We're going to destroy the beast and move on from there. And let's jump into Revelation 16 from this point. Here's where we actually get the 7 bowls described. So 15 is the setup. 16 is where we get them described. In the first 3 bowls, I'm going to read Revelation 16, 1 through 7, and we'll just jump in there. So again, the context for all this is the divine council meeting that began in Revelation 4 and 5. And the slain and risen Lamb of chapter 5 is the revealer and the dispenser of the judgments through the authority of the enthroned Father. So Revelation 16:1 says this, starting there. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple telling the 7 angels, go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. So the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores came upon the people, who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse, and every living thing died that was in the sea. The third angel poured out his blood into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood. And I heard the angel in charge of the waters say, just are you, O Holy One, who is and who was, for you brought these judgments. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve. And I heard the altar saying, yes, Lord God the Almighty, true and just are your judgments. Now that's Revelation 16, 1 through 7, gets us into the first 3 of these. And as was the case way back, not way back, but somewhat way back, with the first trumpet judgment, the first bowl judgment targets the earth. So there's a parallel there. And those afflicted are those having the mark of the beast. Now, the immediate Old Testament point of reference is the of bull. This is Exodus 9 through. There's an ironic reversal here. If you remember the plague back then, again, the Egyptians are the one that get the plague of boils. Here we have those being afflicted are the ones that take the mark of the beast. And so the reversal here is those who take the idolatrous mark of the beast are now marked with boils in God's judgment. So again, there's some irony here that I'm sure John doesn't want readers to miss. But you took the mark, well, God's going to mark you. Here's the first mark. Remember these? The boils from the Egyptian plague judgment. The second and third bowls take us back to the Nile. Obviously, when I read that, I'm sure that's what is popping up in your head. It takes us back to the Nile turning to blood, the initial plague on Egypt, which was Exodus 7, 14 through 25. And in his Revelation commentary, Beale has a good bit to say about this connection. I'm going to read you a good portion of it. It's all good stuff. Again, how the context is going to inform what's going on here. So he says, the second bowl's parallelism with the second trumpet, okay, we don't want to forget that again, Revelation 8, 8 and 9, is striking. The trumpet struck the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died. Likewise, the second bowl strikes the sea, And there came about blood as of a dead person, and every living thing died, the things in the sea. Both texts, he says, are based on Exodus 7:17 through 21, where Moses turns the Nile into blood and the fish in it die, just like in Revelation 8 and 9, Revelation 16:3. Philo, Beale comments, was actually a commentator that extended the effect of the plague in Exodus 7 to include the death of people, which is not a detail you're going to get back in Exodus necessarily, but again, he fills in the gap in it, and he therefore sounds a lot like Revelation here. Beale continues and says, therefore the second trumpet and the second bowl have to do with the same kind of judgment. The primary difference is the trumpet's partial effect and the bowl's total effect. Just as the world kingdom of Babylon was the object of the second trumpet's woe, so likewise the kingdom of Babylon throughout the world, together with that of the beast, is the object of the second bowl's affliction. Indeed, the bowls generally are linked to the judgment of Babylon, as implied from the connection of Revelation 14:8 and 10 with Revelation 15:7 and here in 16:1. The seventh bowl makes the link with Revelation 14:8 and 10 explicit, especially in Revelation 16:19. Here's what it says. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. So the connection between this Exodus imagery and Babylon is very explicit. Beale goes on and says the sea as figurative for ungodly humanity is not inconsistent with other uses of thalassa in the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation. It occurs 24 times. And many of those references are susceptible to such a symbolic interpretation. Beale actually thinks all of them are, except for Revelation 18, 17, 19, and 21. Clearly, the many waters later in Revelation 17:1 are a picture of unbelievers throughout the earth, which is echoed in 17:15. Furthermore, Satan's standing, quote, on the sand of the sea in Revelation 12:18 may refer to his sovereignty over the wicked nations, since in Revelation 20, verse 8, ungodly nations are, again, compared to the sand of the sea. The sea from which the beast of Revelation 13:1 emerges represents the mass of nations. This symbolic understanding of Revelation 16:3 is supported by the explicit figurative interpretation of the bloody rivers and springs of waters in verse 4 as God's judgment on the impious, on unbelievers. So I'm going to just stop there. What Beale's trying to argue here, and I think does a good job, is that this language about the waters, when it refers to the waters being poisoned and polluted with the blood and stuff like that, it's a symbolic way of expressing those who take the mark of the beast, just like the first bowl judgment. They're the ones that are afflicted. Well, the same people are afflicted here. It's not just an affliction of the literal waters, but as Beale's pointing out, some of this language, waters, sand of the sea itself, gets used elsewhere in the book for people, for the mass of nations opposed to God. Again, just think of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview here. The nations against Israel, the nations under dominion, of hostile supernatural forces. Here, we have the beast, we have Satan. So what Beale is saying, again, is a lot of this, we don't want to over-literalize the language here. In fact, we want to look at how the language is used elsewhere in the book. And when you do that, it's used to people, which would make sense because people are being judged in the first bowl judgment. Why would we expect them to not be judged in the second and third bowl judgment? The target is people. It's not just dirt, water, grass. Okay, it's people. It's the people who take the mark are going to be suffering the affliction. Just think back to the Exodus imagery, and the connection is pretty obvious. So to pick up again, Beale again to make reiterate the point. He says the understanding of blood in verse 3 as representing the suffering of the ungodly is warranted by the immediate context, and he refers to verses 2 and 8 through 11, and by the use of blood. The Greek term is haima, elsewhere in Revelation to refer without exception to the suffering of the wicked or of Christ and the saints. So he has a long grocery list of references to blood here that can refer to the suffering of the wicked, which in context makes sense because they're the ones that are the targets of the bowl judgments. So again, I think the specific citation in Revelation 16:6, when we hit this this section here, let me just reiterate it. Just are you, O Holy One, who is and who was, for you brought these judgments, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, and it's what they deserve, so on and so forth. That is a citation of Psalm 79:3, and also, let me just go to Psalm 79:3 here. It's a few verses in Psalm 79. Psalm 79:3, if you go up to the beginning of the psalm, a psalm of Asaph, O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. Obviously, this is a post-Nebuchadnezzar, post-Babylon psalm. They have given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the heavens for food, the flesh of your faithful to the beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water. This is verse 3, all around Jerusalem. There was no one to bury them. You keep going down to verse 10. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Let the avenging of the outpoured blood of your servants be known among the nations before our eyes. Okay, so you have this nation talk in the psalm that John quotes in Revelation 16:6 about blood. Okay, so what Beale is arguing that the symbolism here, again, is once again designed to inform readers who sort of have these cross references in their heads. It's designed to inform readers that the judgment here is about those who take the mark of the beast. They are going to, ironically, have the same thing happen to them that way back in the Old Testament, Babylon did to God's people in Psalm 79. So now it's going to happen to them. Things are going to come full circle. It is an intended reversal strategy that John has here, again, to help the reader see that what he's describing is the defeat of the ultimate chaos agent, Babylon. And this is the natural touch point in the Old Testament for what he's saying here, and what he wants us, what he wants to get across to his readers. I would also want to throw in here, Beale doesn't mention it. Let me just look it up here. Just popped into my head. Deuteronomy 32, not verse 8, but the other Dead Sea Scroll text that is affected or affects Deuteronomy 32 is verse 43. And ESV I'm going to read again because it follows, just like it does in verse 8, it follows the Dead Sea Scrolls here. It says this, rejoice with him, O heavens. You could translate it, O heavenly ones. Bow down to him, all gods. So it starts out where those who are the ones who are going to be rejoicing are the ones, members of the heavenly host, who are loyal to God, and they are commanded. The gods of the nations. This is Deuteronomy 32. Okay, the gods of the nations are commanded to bow down to God and His counsel. Okay, for He avenges. Here's the rest of the verse. For He avenges the blood of His children, and takes vengeance on His adversaries. He repays those who hate Him, and cleanses His people's land. Okay, that verse, Deuteronomy 32:43, I'm a little surprised that Beale doesn't mention it. That verse is a microcosm of what Beale has been saying in his commentary about this chapter, about these first three bowl judgments. It's the judgment of the nations. Those who are under dominion of the beast are the nations. They are all the people who are not the people of God. And this is the eschatological day of the Lord. This is, all of this judgment stuff. This is the day of the Lord. All this stuff's going to be a precursor to the return of the Messiah, to the return of Jesus. And this is the time when the gods are destroyed. So, when we have all this talk about the nations being the target of these judgments, yes, it refers to people who have taken the mark. But even more significantly, it refers to the beast. It's all leading up to chapters 17 and 18, where the beast himself is destroyed. And of course, that's going to lead to the destruction of Satan himself. All of this stuff. Okay, the whole system, both cosmic and earthly, this is where it's going to come to an end. And Deuteronomy 32:43 really, I think, encapsulates that very nicely. Revelation 16:8 through 16, that's the next three bowls, so numbers 4, 5, and 6. And really, let's just read that, and we may just read through the end of the chapter here, but we've got here, the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were scorched by the fierce heat, and they cursed the name of God, who had power over these plagues. They did not repent and give him glory. The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pain and sores. They did not repent of their deeds. The sixth angel poured out his bowl in the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon, or Har Mageddon in Greek. So you have the next three bowl judgments. Bowl 4 begins in verse 8. And the command here, kind of like verse 17, later on. Let me just jump to verse 17, because that's going to be basically the end of the chapter. So let's just go back there. So Revelation 16:17, this is where the seventh bowl starts up. This says, the seventh angel, poured out his bowl into the air. So we have that phrase, the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air. We've got back in verse 8, the fourth angel pouring out his bowl on the sun. And this has drawn interest from commentators because it appears contradictory to Revelation 16, verse 1, the verse that starts out this whole series of bowl judgments, which says, go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. So how in the world can we be pouring out bowls on the sun and on the air? I mean, the bowls are supposed to be poured out on the earth. So commentators have noticed this. And on the most useful thing to say here, he notes that in Revelation 16, 8 and 17, that what John is really informing us of is that what is in view is the ancient conception of matter. So Owen writes this. In Revelation 16:1, the bowl angels are commanded to pour out their libation bowls upon the earth. While this plague is not closely related to the others, it does result in the affliction of the 4 elements. Okay, this plague he means the one here beginning in 16:8 with the sun. It results in the affliction of one of the 4 elements. And this is going to go for 16:17. What were the 4 elements of the conception of matter in the Hellenistic world? That everything was composed of earth, water, fire, and air. And so Owen is basically saying, this is why we get the language we do. It all concerns the earthly existence of people as they know it, and as they understand it, and as they articulate it, that everything's made of earth, water, fire, and air. And so it doesn't matter that you get this verbiage in verse 8 and verse 17 that doesn't say earth. It says, sun, which is the source of heat, source of fire, and air in verse 17. It doesn't matter because it's just ancient elemental thinking. And I think he's really on the right track here. It makes good sense. So in other words, in taking Beale's earlier comments about the symbolic nature of the language just generally to heart, what is described here in all the bowls, even these the ones that have this odd wording, is a judgment of all the earth in its most basic elemental sense. And the goal is to express totality. Okay, all the elements of the earth are affected. And by extension, this is the ancient writer's way of describing that all, not just some or most, all of the followers of the beast will be judged. Every one of them, no matter where they are on the earth. The picture is thus not one of literal, overly literal cosmic upheavals, that have to be dodged by believers. Because, let's be honest, when you get into sort of popular commentary reading of Revelation, these are the kind of passages where, it must be a supernova. Oh, it must be some kind of plague or a virus or, something like that. Well, if the whole point of the bowls is the judgment of those who have taken the mark, okay, if these judgments are literal, then they're going to affect believers. Here's the point. The believers are under the sun too. It's the same sun that shines on a believer as an unbeliever. Believers are under the sun too. So if this is literal, they'd be included. Believers breathe air too. So if this was literal, if we're supposed to read this literally as some kind of poisoning of the air, well, believers would be affected by that too, unless they've got gills or something. Everybody's wearing a space helmet. The literal interpretations here that again are very common in popular commentaries and on the internet, sort of conspiratorial kind of thinking. They just don't work here, because if you're going to keep the bowls in context about being directed toward all of the people who have taken the mark of the beast, these can't be literal judgments of the literal sun and air, because believers are under the same sun and they breathe the same air. So this is, again, part of why Beale and other commentators say that the language here is meant to express elemental totality, with the goal being to communicate the idea that every person who's taken the mark of the beast, no matter where they are, is going to be judged. God isn't going to miss any of them. None of them are getting away. So it's trying to express totality, but over a very specific target audience, if you will, and that is those who've taken the mark. Another irony we get here is that those who have taken the name of the beast curse the name of God, who is now judging them. It's a nice touch. Again, it brings that, the whole thing about the mark of the beast is really about bearing the name that we talked about earlier when we talked about 666. So again, some of these ideas are just getting picked up and they become threads through the whole description. The fifth bowl, we get some questions there. What is the throne of the beast? In Revelation 16:10, we read here, the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. So obviously throne and kingdom are used in parallel there. People gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pain and sores, and did not repent. So what do we make of this? The throne of the beast is not likely a specific place. Nothing in the other judgments suggests this, again, because we're dealing with totality. More likely, and this is Beale's thought, more likely the throne represents the beast's sovereignty over his entire realm. Therefore, the bowl affects the beast's ability to rule anywhere and everywhere. So I'm paraphrasing Beale there. The judgment, of course, itself reminds us of the plague of darkness back in Egypt. That was number 9 in the Exodus plagues, Exodus 10:21-29. And it also reminds us of the fourth trumpet plague back in Revelation 8:12, where the sun, moon, and stars were partially obliterated. Now, as Owen notes, this is, quote, a typical apocalyptic event. And he cites a bunch of Old Testament passages, Isaiah 13:10, Joel 2:10, Joel 3:15, Amos 8:9, Habakkuk 3:11, bunch of Second Temple literature. This is very typical of Day of the Lord apocalyptic description. And he also adds that darkness is a symbol of judgment, in other places. He points out 1 Samuel 2:9, Amos 5:20, which is one of those passages that has the day of Yahweh will be darkness and not light. Joel 2:2 is another, Zephaniah 1:15. So again, it's Day of the Lord imagery from the Old Testament drawn into, what we're reading here with the fifth bowl. And Owen also notes that, quote, it is not immediately evident why the plague of darkness should inflict pain on people who are part of the kingdom of the beast. Okay, well, that's nice. He notes the problem, but he doesn't offer any solution. Beale takes this as metaphorical, so I'm going to read you what he has here, and he relates it to the Egyptians. He says, this pain, why would darkness cause pain? Okay. This pain is metaphorical for all ordained events designed to remind the ungodly that their persecution and idolatry are vain. And it indicates their separation from God. Let me just jump in here because God is the source of light, okay, in biblical thought. Back to Beale. As with the Egyptians, this darkness induces anguish, figuratively expressed by the phrase, they gnawed their tongues because of the pain. God causes all who follow the beast to have times of anguish and horror when they realize that they are in spiritual darkness, and they are separated from God, and that eternal darkness awaits them. The temporal judgment here is a precursor to the final judgment, when unbelievers will be, quote, cast into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's Matthew 8:12, 22:13, and 25:30. That's the end of the Beale quote. And isn't that interesting? You know, we have New Testament passages that associate darkness with pain. And it's really referring in the Gospels, again, to the place of eternal separation from God. And so that's what Beale is playing off here to explain the language of this bowl. And I think it's reasonable. Revelation 16:12 through 21, again, the sixth bowl, and this takes us to the end of the chapter, the seventh bowl. Let me just go back here because we ended with the Armageddon verse. The seventh bowl, this is verse 17 now. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, a great earthquake such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. And the great city was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away. No mountains were to be found. Great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from the heaven on people. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. So, you know, there's a lot here that, again, dovetails into the preceding bowls and then adds a specific element of its own, the hail. And I bring that up because there are some commentators who sort of want to merge these things, but we'll get to that in a moment before we wrap up here, or as we wrap up. So I would say that just in regard to the sixth and seventh bowls, just like the other ones, they're clear references back to Babylon. We have the river Euphrates mentioned. Like, how clear is that to Babylon? And the kings of the East. Okay, well, who are the kings of the East to somebody living in John's day? I got news for you. It's not China. The kings of the East, think where is Israel? Where is Canaan? Now, what's East? Look east. It's Babylon. Okay, it's the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's Babylon. It's the Medes and the Persians and the Babylonians. Okay, this would be obvious, again, to anyone living at the time, acquainted with their geography. And frankly, the rest of these judgments, the first layer of seven, the second layer of seven, here we're in the third layer of seven, and it's all pointing to Babylon as the chief metaphor for the ultimate chaos agent, okay, in this case, in John's writing, the beast and his whole system. So the sixth bowl, again, makes this abundantly clear. You've got this language referring back to Babylon very clearly. In some sense, in some respects, it is like the last judgment due to its overlap with the seventh bowl, because the seventh bowl could be read as a climactic summary. Some commentators do. However, the seventh bowl does have a distinctive element of hail, which again takes us back to the Exodus plagues on Egypt. So I'm content to have them be a discrete 6 and 7, bowls and judgments. But you'll see this sort of merging in other commentators. The sixth bowl further represents a striking parallel to the sixth trumpet. So we have a symmetry there. Both feature the great river Euphrates as the sixth element in the respective sequence. And it's Revelation 9:14 compared to 16:12. In Revelation 16:19, Babylon is specifically noted again as the point of orientation. Kings of the East. Look at what's happening here. These kings of the East are the ones who are going to meet at the place which is in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. For the whole Harmageddon thing, you need to go back and look at Unseen Realm chapter 41. This is not Megiddo. This is Jerusalem. This is Mount Zion. This is where the final apocalyptic battle is going to take place. Harmageddon is not a reference to Megiddo for a number of reasons. Again, just go back and read the material in the book. Unseen Realm chapter 41. It's a reference to the Har Mored, which is the place of the divine council. So the forces of evil, the forces of Babylon, the primary chaos agent, and all his forces, the hordes that are associated with the East, which is Babylon, okay? All of the nations. They are going to march on Jerusalem, which is God's domain, the place of his counsel. It's God's cosmic mountain dwelling place, Jerusalem and Zion. And that is where we are going to find out and see how this all plays out. It's the final confrontation for all the marbles. And it takes place at and really over, and it's really about who will be most high. Who will sit on the throne of Zion? Who will occupy the throne of the cosmic mountain? Is Babylon going to overwhelm Jerusalem and Zion again? Or, again, and we know how the story ends, is everything going to be reversed from the way it was the first time? And of course, the answer is the latter. So after the Babel rebellion, think of it this way. After the Babel rebellion back in Genesis 11, and that judgment, of the nations, assigning them to lesser members of the heavenly host, out of which emerges the Deuteronomy 32 worldview with the princes, the supernatural princes over geographical nations and the principalities and the powers and all this stuff, okay? After that is launched, that awful situation of the third rebellion in the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, after that occurs, in the flow of biblical history, Egypt emerged as the nation that was the central enemy. They are the face of chaos in the ensuing biblical story, because we have Abraham called, we've got Isaac born, we've got Jacob, Israel. Israel winds up down in Egypt, and they're almost exterminated. So Egypt emerges as the primary face of chaos, but it doesn't stay with them. Obviously, Babylon emerges again as rightfully it that way of the situation that was begun on its own doorstep, as it were. Egypt gets displaced by Babylon in that role, and Babylon's status as the emblem of anti-Eden transcends that of Egypt, because it's Babylon, and Babylon succeeded where Egypt did not. Babylon conquered Jerusalem, destroyed it, destroyed the temple, sent the people of God into exile. Now, God used them. God is still behind this. It was a judgment for Israel's own idolatry. We understand that. But Babylon succeeds where Egypt did not, with the destruction of the nation of Israel and Zion via the exile. And all of this imagery, all of this back history connected specifically to Babylon is strewn throughout all of these judgments. They're not about Russia. They're not about Asia or China, okay? You have to think more transcendently. You have to think about just chaos in general. The forces of cosmic and human evil, humans that are aligned with cosmic evil in general. That is who the end time enemy is. The whole system. It's not tied to one geographical entity that we're familiar with. Okay, we don't want to use a single geographical entry or even a couple as filters through which to interpret Revelation, when none of that would have been in John's head. And he's trying to communicate the totality of the problem. And the best way you do that is Babylon, because of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and the history of what happened to Zion before. So it's quite misguided, again, to try to pin the beast tail on some nation that we don't like today. I'm not saying we should like them, okay? But that misses the point. It's so much bigger than that. It's everything. It's the whole system. It's the whole world. Everything aligned against Christ and his people. So all of this sets the stage for the ultimate reversal. Revelation 17 and 18, the fall of Babylon. And that's what we'll get into as we keep going. We're going to do 17 and 18 today, and there's a lot of, overlap, a good fair number of overlaps between these chapters and stuff we've already hit. So, we're not going to rehearse everything, that we
did before. We're not going to cover all that turf again. So I'm going to pick my spots. For instance, we've talked before about Babylon being a chaos symbol and a metaphor. That was chapter 14. It's going to pop up again here. We've talked about its relationship to Rome, and so we're not going to repeat that material. In this episode, we're going to try to focus on the identity of Mystery Babylon and how it's rooted in, Old Testament descriptions maybe of idolatry and specifically injustice to the nations. And again, if that sounds like Psalm 82, take note of that, because it is kind of surprising, how much, let's put it this way, when you're talking about Babylon and you're talking about a system, because this is the book of Revelation, okay, the city of Babylon itself is not a big deal anymore. There is no Babylonian empire. So we get John talking about Rome, the big bad empire of its day, the last empire of Daniel 2, because that's when the kingdom of God, comes into the picture during the Roman Empire. I mean, we're very clearly talking about Roman stuff throughout the book of Revelation. So John is going to use Babylon, Old Testament Babylon, as a way to talk about the great enemy that the church is facing, okay, when he's writing the book of Revelation. Well, everybody sort of knows that, but do we realize what we're talking about when we talk about Babylon as a system? That's the Deuteronomy 32 rebellion. That's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the judgments that are meted out, whether it's the trumpets or the bowls or, whatever set of judgments we're talking about, are judgments on the nations. They're judgments on the people who have aligned themselves with the beast, i.e. with Babylon, with these other nations that are against, not just, not Israel, ethnic Israel in this case, but against, the new Israel of God, i.e. the church. And again, I'm not a total, replacement theologian kind of guy, and my audience knows that. I refer to the church as a new Israel, not the new Israel. I do think there's an eschatological destiny for Israel, geographic Israel. But you have to be thinking in these modes. It makes a lot of sense to read through the book of Revelation. We got judgments against the nations, judgments against the people of those nations, tied up with the day of the Lord, which is when those things happen in the Old Testament. And ultimately, though the gods of those nations, supernatural evil, they're going to lose total control. They're going to be destroyed. So they're no longer going to govern the nations. I mean, their authority's already been stripped away. People who've read Unseen Realm or the Demon's Book already know this. People who listen to our Colossians series, when we got to Colossians 3, you're going to know that Paul unites the idea of the resurrection with the nullification of the authority of the fallen sons of God of the Old Testament, the gods of the Old Testament, who are Paul's principalities and powers, and so on and so forth. All these things intertwine. And so when you're here in the book of Revelation, and you see these judgments being played out the day of the Lord, another element of this that's being described is the final death of the gods. Okay, this is when the judgment of Psalm 82 comes to pass. And these chapters 17 and 18 are leading up to, again, or they're dealing. We've both led up to, and we're dealing with the fall of Babylon, the fall of Babel, the fall of the whole system, and the death of its gods. That's really going to take place at Armageddon. Because what is Armageddon? It is not a battle at Megiddo. Okay, it is a battle for Zion. It's a battle for the seat of divine authority. It's the Har Moed, the mountain of assembly, the Mount of Assembly, which in the Old Testament, again, on the pagan side is going to be, Baal's mountain and so on and so forth. But on the Israelite side, on Yahweh's side, this is Zion. This is Jerusalem. This is where the battle is. This is what it's about. This is all stage setting for the ultimate conflict between the Deuteronomy 32 Babel system and Yahweh himself for supremacy. That's what it is. And so when we read through the book of Revelation, those people in this audience who understand what the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is, you ought to be able to, it ought to be jumping out at you in this talk about the nations and the beast and Babylon. I mean, again, how could you miss it? It's just that we're not taught about eschatology in this way. We are taught systems, and those systems are typically applied to, well, what's going on in Russia? What's going on in some other country? We isolate it geographically, or maybe we literalize Babylon. And a literalized Babylon approach is better than a literalized Russia or China approach. I mean, because that makes no sense at all. But this is the way we're typically taught, or we're taught to spiritualize everything where there's really nothing going on, boots on the ground here. There's no heaven and earth symbiosis. This is just all ethereal. It's the church against evil in a very abstract, ethereal sense. Because again, if you're the amillennialist or somebody like that, you're typically in your tradition, you're not thinking about the reclaiming of the nations in real time, just like they were lost. You're not thinking in those modes. And so I'm hoping that as we've gone through 15 and 16 and now Revelation 17 and 18, these things will start to, again, recur in your mind and just jump out at you, because this is really what these chapters are about. They're stage setting for the ultimate conflict over who is the Most High. Who is the Most High? Is it going to be the beast and that system, or is it going to be the God of the Bible? So I want to jump in here and just, again, start pecking away at some of the things that we haven't addressed in too much detail to this point, and sort of fill in the gaps. So let's just start in chapter 17 with the woman who is the prostitute. Some translations will have harlot. So I'll just read a few verses here. One of the seven angels, this is chapter 17, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of those of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. Again, let me just stop there. Full of blasphemous names. Well, blasphemous names, these are spiritual competitors. Okay, they're the names of the gods and the other nations. I mean, they're in the wilderness. This is the realm of the dead in the Old Testament. This is cosmic chaos. This is anti-Eden. All these things, all the things that you read about in Unseen Realm just sort of wind up somewhere and do, in the last few chapters of the book of Revelation. They just do, because they're very cosmic in their orientation. But anyway, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. Again, we've seen that before. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, and holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Now, the spiritual adultery, something real simple like that. I mean, we're not dealing with literal adultery, but adultery is an Old Testament metaphor for idolatry, for spiritual unfaithfulness, for worshiping other gods. Why does it make sense here? Why does it fit here? Because it's Babel. Okay, this is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Nothing could make more sense. This is the whole point. It's the gods of the world that are going to be arrayed and aligned against the God of Israel and his people. Okay, that's the end of days scenario. It's the day of the Lord. It's the final judgment of the gods. And it comes down to this one final conflict. Again, what I'm trying to communicate is that the language, the stuff, the fornication stuff, the harlot, these ways in the Old Testament that idolatry and loyalty to some other god, i.e., one of the gods appointed, allotted to the nations back at the Deuteronomy 32 rebellion at the Tower of Babel, this is the way idolatry is described. So it should be no surprise. It should be just, firing off the radar in your head,
Again, the biblical theological Deuteronomy 32 worldview radar should be just, ringing in your head that this is the setting for what we're reading, what's going on in these chapters. But again, we're just not taught about end times this way. We're taught some system, and then there you go. Be warmed and filled, pick your system, and away you go. And it's like it's not tied anywhere to an Old Testament worldview or a supernatural worldview context. And again, that's just a shame. How many times have you heard me say that on the podcast? But here we are again. So back to the woman here and the description, seated on many waters, again, the theme of the immorality and so on and so forth. So it's important, again, I'm just going to rabbit trail a little bit here, because one of the things you read is that this is actually Babel, the beast, is actually a description of Jerusalem. Now I'm just going to say it. I think this is an unfortunate. I'm going to try to be a little kind here. I think this is an unfortunate anti-Semitic trajectory and interpretation. We need to remember from the outset, there's a difference between an unfaithful wife and a prostitute. Okay, those two are on the same page, but they are not the same thing. Really, in most respects, not at all. There's also a difference between the seducer and the one who gets seduced. Okay, so just hold those thoughts. And I'm going somewhere with this, but I want to rabbit trail a little bit on this notion that Babylon here is Israel or Jerusalem. I don't think that's the case at all. So Keener writes in his New International NIV application commentary on Revelation, which I don't think we've used to this point before, but I've just been reading through it, and there's a lot of good stuff in here, as you'd expect with Keener. But anyway, the Old Testament prophets, he writes, often portrayed Israel as a woman, either God's faithful bride when pure, for example, Isaiah 54, 5 and 6, Isaiah 62, 5, or Hosea 2, 19 and 20, or as an adulteress when unfaithful to him, unfaithful to God. Leviticus 17, 7, Isaiah 1, 21, Jeremiah 3, 1, Ezekiel 16, 20. Of course, Ezekiel 16 is the big one. Revelation contrasts two cities, Jerusalem and Babylon, as a bride and a prostitute, respectively. So out of the gate, this is not Jerusalem, because the contrast between Babylon and Jerusalem has already been given in the book. We're going to get this in Revelation 17:5 here, as you're reading a few verses ahead, like we just did, and also Revelation 21:2. This is going to become clear. So in two Old Testament instances, Keener writes, the prostitute is not Israel, Judah, or Jerusalem, but an evil world empire. So there's Old Testament precedent for the harlot, the prostitute image being used of a world pagan empire. And those two instances were Nineveh and Tyre. Tyre is going to become a little important as we proceed. Back to Keener, he says, Nineveh will seduce the nations with her prostitution and witchcraft, Nahum 3:4. And Tyre will play the prostitute with, quote, all the kingdoms on the face of the earth, Isaiah 23:17. Yet her wealth will ultimately be laid up for the righteous. Let me just stop there. It's the theme of wealth that loops Tyre into this. If you go back to, remember, Ezekiel 28. Okay, Ezekiel 28, the seat of the gods, it's the divine council. It's, we've talked a lot about divine council stuff in there, Eden stuff, the mountain of God, the garden of God there in Ezekiel 28. But the other thing that happens in Ezekiel 28 is you get the gemstones, you get terminology for economic wealth and prosperity, and how this is used to bring other nations under the power, under the influence of Tyre, okay, in that chapter. And so that idea of using wealth to entice other nations into relationships and ultimately into idolatrous relationships is going to be part of what's happening here in the book of Revelation. It's going to be part of the description to describe this massive world system. And ultimately it's going to emerge as the Babel world system, because Babylon is the last power standing that actually succeeds in destroying the people of God in the Old Testament. Tyre doesn't. Egypt didn't. It's going to be Babylon, okay? And again, that's
that ties back very obviously in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. But again, I'm just throwing stuff out at this point. There are things that are going to pop up in this chapter that they seem not related, but they actually are related. It's seduction, it's idolatry, it's spiritual unfaithfulness, and ultimately it's the Deuteronomy 32 rebellion. So let's go back to Keener. Keener says, some scholars have proposed that Babylon here partly symbolizes Jerusalem. Others suggest it predicts a revived role for a literal Babylon. But especially in view of its place on 7 hills, that's going to be verse 9 of chapter 17, most commentators recognize that Rome is in view, whether or not they believe the text also looks beyond Rome, like further into the future. As commentators often also recognize, Babylon the prostitute is a deliberate contrast with the New Jerusalem as the bride. Okay, again, there's this contrastive element. Others also contrasted Zion and Babylon, lamenting Babylon's prosperity, but anticipating its judgment. Second Temple writers do this. Second Baruch 11, Fourth Ezra 3. I mean, this is not new to either Keener or myself or New Testament scholars today. There are going to be Second Temple Jewish writers that see the deliberate contrast prophetically between Babylon and Jerusalem. Now, that's the end of the Keener quote. You could say, okay, you have the prostitute motif used of foreign empires. Okay, that's fair. Keener's given us 2 examples here. But someone could come back and say, well, Ezekiel 16 describes Israel as a whore, and that's true. Jeremiah 2:20, really through chapter 4, verse 30 does that. But, we need to think a little bit more about what's going on in these passages. On the Jeremiah description, Jeremiah 2-4, of Judah as a prostitute, Beale and McDonough note the following. They say, in that passage, Judah is a harlot who has, quote, a harlot's forehead, that's Jeremiah 3:3, and causes others to sin, on whose skirts is found the lifeblood of the innocent, Jeremiah 2:34, whose dress is in scarlet, who decorates herself with ornaments of gold, Jeremiah 4, verse 30, and whose lovers will despise her and try to kill her. Israel is called a harlot because although she is supposedly committed to Yahweh, she has spiritual intercourse with idols. And again, it's idolatry. But there's a problem here. But in Revelation, the point of reference is to a specific city. It's not to a country. It's not to a region. It's to a specific city that seduces others by means of idolatry and injustice. It's not to a country that was seduced by such things like Israel. I mean, Israel is the one who gets seduced. This is, by the way, that's Deuteronomy 32 as well. This is the first time we read in the Torah, where we read of Israel actually getting seduced to worship other gods. It's Deuteronomy 32. I think 10, 11, 12, right around there, we actually get verse 17, of course, where Israel, is blamed for worshiping, gods, the Shadim, and so on and so forth. So Israel is the one who gets caught up in this. They get seduced by the gods of the nations. The gods of the nations come after Yahweh's children to make them disloyal. And so Israel, Judah, whatever, becomes what Babylon already is. Okay, they get seduced by this. They're not the one that is going to go out and seduce other nations. You're not going to have any passage in the Old Testament where Israel or Jerusalem, is going to go out and make the other nations idolaters. They're already idolaters. That doesn't make any sense. So I think we need to be thinking a little bit more about what is actually described in the book of Revelation is a city that has been the engine of chaos. Not a victim, not one who's been seduced, like you could say Israel was, but this is the one that drives the bus. This is the one who's driving the idolatry bus. So the reason Israel receives harlot prostitution imagery is because she has become idolatrous. She has been seduced, not because she lures other nations into that condition. The prostitute of Revelation 17 is not a victim. The prostitute of Revelation 17 is the engine of chaos. And that just isn't Jerusalem. It makes no sense. So Beale and McDonough again chime in. They say, despite, some of these references to Judah, okay, or Ezekiel 16, whatever, they say harlot can also refer to other ungodly nations in the prophets, as in Isaiah 23, 15 through 18, Nahum 3, 4 and 5. They mention one Dead Sea Scroll text that applies the Nahum text to other apostates even within, Israel. But again, the Old Testament precedent for this is other nations. They comment that the harlot metaphor has the essential idea of an illicit relationship, whether that be religious, economic, political, or a combination of these. In both Nahum 3 and especially Isaiah 23, Nineveh and Tyre are called harlots because they ruin and they spread uncleanness among the nations by economically dominating them and influencing them by their idolatry. Furthermore, the whore in Revelation 17 is called specifically, explicitly, Babylon the Great, which refers to Babylon, okay, not Jerusalem, but Babylon. And, by extension, it's going to be Rome because that's the enemy of the time. Therefore, Babylon refers both to the pagan world and apostate Israel and to the apostate church. Anybody who cooperates with the Babel system is committing spiritual idolatry. But the great whore herself is Babylon. She is the one, again, she's the engine of chaos, the engine of anti-Eden, the one driving, the one propelling the ruination of all nations, and especially targeting the people of Yahweh to turn against him, as sort of the final end game of the Deuteronomy 32 rebellion. Now, there are other reasons why, and that are more obvious, why the prostitute wouldn't be Jerusalem as well. I'm just going to run through these real quickly. The other imagery describing her, again, the prostitute, clearly belongs to either Babylon from the Old Testament or, again, Rome by extension in John's own time period, but not to Jerusalem. So here's a few examples. One, most obviously, the woman is identified as Babylon the Great. Okay, that's takes kind of the ambiguity out of it. Number two, Babylon is said to be drunk with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. That's verse 6 in Revelation 17. Now, earlier in the book, the martyrdom of the faithful is associated with the material in Daniel fulfilled through Antiochus IV, again, the little horn, the Antichrist figure, who's a Gentile. While Jews did kill Christians, Acts 7 with Stephen, for example, this does happen in the book of Acts. There were no full-scale persecutions of Christians anywhere near the level of Roman persecution in New Testament times. There just weren't. Yeah, you can tell Saul to go to Damascus and take Christians captive. What is he going to do? Bring a few dozen with him? Okay, we're talking massive scale, concerted, empowered, funded, persecution by an empire of believers. Okay, you don't get that with the Jewish communities. I mean, it's very localized and sporadic and sparse and so on. I mean, again, you read about this stuff in the book of Acts where somebody gets beaten or, they get shunned from the synagogue, and okay, that obviously that stuff happens. That is not the kind of scale of persecution that is being described in the book of Revelation for Babylon, for the great whore. It's nowhere close. Third, Babylon is described as a city whose people dwell by many waters. Now, Beale notes that this particular point of description about end-time Babylon and her judgment is Jeremiah 13, which, if you do follow on in the Septuagint, actually Jeremiah 28:13 in the Septuagint. That you say, well, how in the world can it be 30 chapters different? In some of the major prophets, the numbering, the sequence of the prophets and the chapters in those prophets is dramatically different than you get in the traditional Masoretic text. So that's why. If you read my book, The Bible Code Myth, you would learn that in an appendix. Anyway, the description is taken from Jeremiah 51, Masoretic text, Jeremiah 28 in the Septuagint, where Jeremiah predicts absolute judgment on historical Babylon. Quote, For his, that is God's wrath, is against Babylon to destroy it utterly, against the inhabitants of Babylon dwelling on many waters. So right there it is. And that's actually the Septuagint, Jeremiah 28:11 through 13. Now, Beale and McDonough note in this regard as well, this many waters description and some of the other descriptors here. They say that the fact that the phrase fallen, fallen is Babylon of Isaiah 21 appears in the book of Revelation in the next chapter, Revelation 18, verse 2, as well as in the preceding text earlier in the book, Revelation 14:18, which itself looks ahead to chapter 17 and 18, where we are today. That fact again points to the fact that we're talking about Babylon itself, not Jerusalem or something like that. Isaiah 21:1 uniquely combines the apparent disparate images of desert and sea. Now, I'm going to go back and read just a few things here. I'm going to read Revelation 17, a couple of the verses that we read already, just so that you follow Beale and McDonough's point here. So the chapter starts out, and one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with the kings of the earth," so on and so forth. And then verse 3 says, "He carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast." So you get the waters. How can the woman be on many waters and then also be into a wilderness where she's sitting? And Beale and McDonough say what's happening here is John is taking two items from the Old Testament, Isaiah 21:1, Isaiah 21:9, and combining them and using them both here. So let me just read Isaiah 21:1. I'm going to actually let me just look this up real quickly in the Septuagint, since that's basically what John is going to be doing here. So Isaiah 21:1, "As a squall might pass through a desert, coming from a desert out of a land, fearsome is the vision and harsh. It was reported to me," so on and so. He's going to go off against the Elamites and the Persians and so on and so forth. And you get down to verse 9, when the prophet is again railing against these other nations. He says, I'll go to verse 8. "The Lord said, I stood through every day, and I stood over the camp the whole night, and look," here's verse 9, "he himself is coming, a rider of a pair of horses. And he answered and said, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all its statues and its handiworks have been crushed to the earth." So there you have in Isaiah 21:1 and 9, you have this desert idea, and then you have the many waters idea. And so again, there's only really, Beale and McDonough would say, we know where both images are found in the same chapter in the Old Testament about Babylon. And the fact that John uses them both here pretty much tells us really clearly that John's talking about Babylon, not Jerusalem or some other place. Okay. Isaiah 17. In Isaiah 17:12 through 13, we might as well just throw that in here as well. Beale does not mention this, but I'm going to just loop it in here. So this is, again, one of the oracles against the nations. This is a general one, woe to the nations. I'm going to just read you these two verses. "Woe to you, multitude of many nations. You will be troubled like a swelling sea, and the back of many nations will resound like water. Many nations are like much water, as when much water rushes with force." Okay, so there you go. You have the equation of many nations with many waters. And so when the prostitute in Revelation 17 is sitting upon many waters, and later on in the chapter, both in chapter 17 and 18, the judgments are against many nations. Again, this is Babylon. This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. When you think Babylon, you should think the fallen sons of God, the fallen gods of the nations of the Old Testament that emerged from the same rebellion at the Tower of Babel. And so this is why we would expect the great beast, the great prostitute, all these images, sitting upon many waters and many nations. All of these things they go together. It's sort of like a recipe for chaos. If you think about it, the desert. Okay, that's anti-Eden. It's completely 180 degrees away from what Eden was. Because deserts are places where you die. They don't have enough food, enough water. They're terrible. You suffer there. Well, that's anti-Eden. Okay, many waters. Well, we don't live in the seas. We don't live in the waters. These are scary. They're unpredictable. Humans can't live there. It's the force of death. It's one of these great, metaphors of the Old Testament. Yeah, it's exactly what Eden wasn't. And all these things, even though to our eye they look like, what in the world is this guy trying to say? He's talking about waters. He's talking about deserts. He's talking about prostitution. He's talking about a beast that comes from the waters, and it's got all these heads and all these nations and crowns. And what in the world is all of these things actually go together? Because they're all ways to describe the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where all the nations of the world are under dominion of other gods who hate Yahweh and his people. It's actually very simple. What we're reading here in these chapters in Revelation and elsewhere is that the pieces are disassembled and the pieces get talked about individually. But when you put all the pieces together, they make sense when they're together, because this is what they describe. Going on again with the list of again, why we don't have Jerusalem here. Jerusalem doesn't have 7 hills, neither does Babylon. And that's fine, because Rome does. Rome is described that way in coinage and other primary sources of the period and where John's living. Again, it's a way for John to draw attention to Rome while he's using Babylon language to unite the two. Again, they're anti-Eden, the forces of chaos. Another one, the description of the beast in Revelation 17, upon which the prostitute rides, derives from Daniel 7. Okay, if we look at Daniel 7, the 4th beast is the one whose destruction is prophesied, there in Daniel 7, that bears a resemblance to Revelation 17. But think about Daniel. The 4th beast of Daniel 7 is the one who persecutes faithful Israelites and Jews, and that one is analogous to the 4th kingdom of Daniel 2. And it's in the 4th kingdom, the time of the 4th kingdom, in that series of 4 Gentile empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, okay? The 4th kingdom is, very obviously Rome. It's not Jerusalem. The 4th kingdom isn't Jerusalem. The 4th kingdom gets destroyed by the kingdom made without hands, the kingdom of God. When do we see the kingdom of God re-inaugurated on earth? That would be during the time of Jesus, which is, of course, is during the time of the Roman Empire. Again, all these things fit, even though it gets confusing when you're looking at individual pieces. Another one, Revelation 17:15. Let's go read that. The angel said to me, it can't be any clearer than this, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Where do we get those? Deuteronomy 32, Babel, Tower of Babel incident. So in light of the explicit clarity there, it's very evident in Revelation 17 and what's going to follow in Revelation 18 should be understood in the context of the Babel rebellion, the Babel chaos failure at the heart of Deuteronomy 32. Another one, Revelation 17:12 has roots in the Septuagint, back into Daniel 4 and Daniel 7, that can only point to Babylon. So what does Revelation 17:12 say? The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings that have not yet received royal power. They are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour. Here's the phrase, for 1 hour. Hold on to that. Together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. So Beale and McDonough write in this regard, they say, as Daniel 7:4-7 was the source of the 7 heads, so Daniel 7:7-8, and verses 20 and 24 are the source of the 10 horns. And all you got to do is read through Daniel 7 and you'll see that. Daniel identifies the horns with kings, and Revelation 17:12 does the same, as it begins to reveal further details about how that prophecy will be fulfilled. The king's future reign with the beast will last for a period referred to as 1 hour. The time period echoes that given in Daniel 4:17 in the Septuagint, where it refers to the period during which God caused King Nebuchadnezzar to become like a beast. Okay, the same language is used. Here also God is sovereign, even over the authority of ungodly kings who ally with the beast in order to prepare to oppose the Messiah. The phrase 1 hour is repeated in chapter 18, Revelation 18, with reference to the time in which, quote, Babylon the Great, unquote, was judged by God. It's Revelation 18:10, Revelation 18:17 and 19, which is a combination, or which is a combined allusion to the 1 hour from Daniel 4:17. So, essentially what you have here is, well, let me just throw one last one in here. In Revelation 17:18 excludes Jerusalem, but fits Babylon and Rome very well. Let me just read that. Revelation 17:18. The woman you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Okay, at no time did Jerusalem have dominion over the kings of the whole earth. You could say that about Babylon. You could say that about Rome. Again, given the nations that were in the biblical worldview and the Mediterranean context and all that. Again, it's very clear that the beast is Babylon. Okay, the woman, it's all Babylon, applied to, used as a cipher, or used as a symbolic tool by which to talk about Rome. This should all be just explicitly clear. There's nothing that would loop Jerusalem, into this description as the beast or as the great prostitute or anything like that. So I've spent a lot of time on this, again, because I want you to see that chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18 are setting up a final conflict between God and the Babel system. It's not between God and Jerusalem. Okay? The final battle, Armageddon, is going to be fought at Zion, at Jerusalem. But they are not, that isn't God's enemy. God's enemy here is, again, the Deuteronomy 32 thing, the nations of the world and all that align themselves with the beast who controls the nations of the world and has seduced the nations of the world into worshiping him, okay? So this is going to be, as we proceed into chapters 19 and especially 20, you're probably already thinking, well, isn't this scene, this whole scene, this whole setup sounds like what's going to happen in chapter 20. How can it be happening here? Okay, because again, if you're asking that question, you've been taught to read the book of Revelation in linear fashion. What we're going to see when we get to Revelation 19 and 20, especially 20, we may hit it in 19. I'm still not sure how I want to do those chapters. But you're going to see that Revelation 20 is actually a condensed version of stuff we've seen before in the book. Okay, this goes back to, should we read Revelation as a linear chronology of events, or do things in the book repeat themselves in cycles? Okay, that's one of the interpretive problems or controversies in the book of Revelation. And I actually think the truth is, well, it does both. It just depends where you're at, rather than pick a system. Because again, the system will say, well, it only does this, and therefore we're amillennialists. Or no, it's a linear chronology, therefore we're pre-trib, pre-mill, whatever. Look, both of them happen. And I'm going to show you when we get to chapters 19 and 20, again, specifically how one passage in the Old Testament, it's going to be Ezekiel 38 and 39, how that gets repurposed in these chapters, 17, 18, 19, 20, to show you that John is using that to describe a repetitive cycle of events. So there are going to be those who say, well, if you take it that way, then there is no millennium. Meredith Kline is one of those. And I quote him in Unseen Realm. He is very famous. He might be the only evangelical I've ever seen that understand Har Moed, Harmageddon is not Megiddo, but it refers to Jerusalem. Okay, outside evangelicalism, you have scholars that have known this for a long time. But again, evangelicals typically get married to a theological or eschatological system, and they never see this stuff. They're never going back into the Old Testament and looking at the precedent. Well, Klein does. but Klein actually uses it to argue for, I think he's a post-millennialist, or no, not a post. I think he's an amillennialist. I think that's how he uses it. I don't think his conclusion is at all necessary. That'll surprise the guy who reviewed my Demons book in Master's Seminary Journal, who thinks I'm an amillennialist. But that's a subject for a different podcast. It's amusing how you can be so misread. But when people can't think outside the box, their own boxes, this is what you get. So we're going to get into that. And I already know that some of you are thinking, this just sounds like Revelation 20, where Satan is released and the nations surround Jerusalem. And, that's after the millennium, Mike. That isn't leading up to Armageddon. Well, actually it is. And actually it's describing the same thing. But again, that doesn't mean that we don't have these things actually occurring in real time. And that's what somebody like Klein, who wants to resist because he's committed to a certain end time system that doesn't have a literal kingdom. Okay, I do. And we'll get to that at that point. So I wanted to stress some of this, that there's a deep connection between chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, with a battle lines being formed. It's all stage setting for Armageddon. And Armageddon is going to be about the nations aligned against God and his people at Jerusalem, just like Revelation 20 describes. Okay, and I just want people to know that you can see it, but then you're going to think that we're reading things out of order because of the way you've been taught to approach the book of Revelation. So I just want to lay that out there. It's both for today and for a subsequent episode. But for the rest of our time today, I don't want to park, on all of that. I want us to think a little bit about, why is it this way? Like what is this sort of leading up to? What's sort of the takeaway point? And here's what I think it is. I think that when we read Revelation 17 and 18, and we get all this Babylon stuff, we get all the nations, the many waters, the spiritual adultery, blah, 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 the great whore, and all this stuff. Again, that looks just weird. It looks abstract. It looks like none of these things have any relationship to each other at all, but they all do, because there are ways of describing allegiance to other gods instead of Yahweh. There are ways of describing the Deuteronomy 32 rebellion, all this stuff. I want you to be thinking the rest of the time how Psalm 82 links the judgment of the gods over the nations with not only these themes, but also the whole theme of injustice, social, economic injustice, just the chaos that the gods sow in the nations. Remember Psalm 82, where what is God so angry at the gods for? Now, he has allotted the gods to the other nations. He has abandoned the nations because he's judging them for the whole Tower of Babel episode. He's fragmented them through the languages. We all know the Tower of Babel story, okay? What we miss is the allotment of the gods to the nations and the nations to these other gods. If you've read Unseen Realm, this is old hat by now. Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20, Deuteronomy 17:1 through 3, Deuteronomy 29:23 through 26, you get this allotment language of the host of heaven. The host of heaven are called Elohim in these passages. They are called gods, and these gods have been allotted to the nations. God has taken Israel. This is the language of Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20. He has taken Israel to be his own, and he has judged the other ones. You get to Deuteronomy 32, when the Most High divides up the nations, he divides them up according to the number of the sons of God. Israel is Yahweh's own portion. And again, it's a judgment. And so what happens next in the biblical story is that God says, okay, we're done now. You don't get to set up your own religious system where you build a ziggurat. It's part of a temple complex. And then I come to you and say, what do you want? Okay, you're doing exactly the opposite I told you to do. We repeated the Edenic mandate. You're supposed to disperse all over the earth and reclaim it for me. We're here to try to kickstart Eden again, folks. And you don't seem to get it. Fine. Let's see if you get this. I'm out of here. I am no longer having a relationship with you. I'm going to allot you to these lesser members of the heavenly host. And then next, I'm going to go call this dude Abraham, and his wife, and I'm going to raise up through them a new Adam, a new humanity, a new people for me. Because that's why I started Eden. I want a human family. You don't seem willing, so long. Okay, now we're going to start it again. We're going to do it again. And Abraham and Sarah are perfect because she cannot have children. This is wonderful. Because when I enable her to have a child, no one on the face of the earth is going to be able to deny that the only reason this people exists, Israel, is because of a supernatural act on my behalf. I get the credit. Okay, I'm the creator. Nobody else is. And so this is what God does. Now, when he does it, he makes Abram a promise in Genesis 12, chapter right after Babel, and says, now look, it's going to be, I'm going to promise you all sorts of things. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to multiply you. You're going to be like the stars. And, and we've had, David Burnett on in the past talking about the star language. It's not just quantity. It refers to a quality that this is the people who are going to be with me in a new Eden. It's the language of glorification. It's not just quantity, but quality. But you know what? Those nations that I just divorced, we're not forgetting them, because one day, just like I told Eve that one day she's going to have a human child, there's going to be a human being that extends from her lineage who will be born, who will undo the effects of this disaster that happened in the Garden of Eden. So just like I told her that, I'm going to tell you something. One of your seed is going to be the key, going to be the conduit through which all of these other nations are going to be brought back into the family. I will have my people from them. Okay, I'm not going to abandon them permanently. They're on the shelf now, but I'm going to use you to bring them back, to bring the nations back. And this is the Old Testament, story. Now, what happens is that the gods who are appointed over these other nations, and since God is still interested in them, I mean, if you're a member of some other nation in Old Testament times, there's no rule against you joining Israel, except for one. You must abandon other gods. You must turn your back on all other gods. You must confess that Yahweh is the God of all gods, and that he has entered into a covenant relationship with these people known as Israel. And when I join them, I will worship no other. I will trust no other. I will presume that no other deity will, rescue me from Sheol. I will presume that he is the God of all gods, and that only he is capable of rescuing me from death, ultimately. This is what you must believe, and there's no rule against anybody believing it. We know that there are pagans and Gentiles in the Old Testament who come over, they switch sides. There's no barrier to that other than turning their backs on their gods. So, this is what's going on. Well, the gods of the nations, their strategy becomes, okay, well, we'll just seduce Yahweh's people into abandoning him. We're going to turn them into idolaters. And the people under our charge, we're going to enslave them. We're going to make them dependent on us. We're going to sow so much chaos in their lives. We're going to sow so much fear in their lives that they're going to be so paralyzed with fear that they wouldn't think of leaving us, because we'll retaliate. We'll destroy them. It's a fear-based, power-based, abuse-based, chaos-based system. And if you read Psalm 82, this is what you get in verses 2 through 5. This is what they're doing, and this is why God is angry. So I want you to be thinking about all that as a background, because when you head into the rest of Revelation 17 and 18, there are a number of places where it describes the economic, injustice. And what I mean by that is ways that those who hold power enslave people economically through what they can eat, through what they own or what they don't own. They create economic dependence on this. You go to Revelation 17, 1 through 2, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. With the kings of the earth, they have committed sexual immorality. Okay, so they hold the power brokers in their hands, okay? You get to Revelation 18:2 and 3. That's Revelation 70. Here's Revelation 18:2 and 3. Let's just go to verse 1. Then after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority. The earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth. They're now all of a sudden we throw in the merchants. Again, the people who will use wealth to victimize and enslave others, okay? The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So there we add the economic element. You keep reading in chapter 18. You get to verse 5. We see it again. For her sins, Babylon's sins are heaped up, and God her iniquity. She herself and back others. Repay her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her like a measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow. The mourning I shall never see. M-O-U-R. She's not going to see disaster. For this reason, her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine. She will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. You go down a little bit further. You get verses 10 through 17. Look at how Babylon is described. Alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants, there they are again, of the earth, weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood. There's just a long grocery list of spices. This is the economic center because Babylon was the dominant world empire. Okay, let me just be real simple. It's like Thomas Jefferson said. Okay, the more that the government gives you, the more it can take away. Okay, when you are under its authority, when you are dependent on it, it will strangle you. You have now given it the power to crush you and to control you and manipulate you. This is what, we live in America, but we're still fond of saying, things like, and it's true. When is the last time government surrendered power? It doesn't. And this is why economic power and other kinds of manipulative power are used in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and here in Revelation. Revelation picks up all these themes. I'm reading the book of Revelation, reading Revelation 18. So this is why these things are referenced, because when a system of power owns you, you're trapped. Okay, you're going to suffer greatly to ever get out from under it. It will not allow it. It will not tolerate you excusing yourself from the arrangement. It owns you. And it's an abuse of power. It's an opportunity for chaos. It's an opportunity to exploit and destroy. And this is why the book of Revelation casts Babel in these economic terms, and that goes right back to Psalm 82. It goes right back there. This is the kind of abuse of people that God does not want. God is not in favor of coercive, abusive power exercised by people over other people, and he's not in favor of it because ultimately, when it is evil and coercive and abusive, ultimately, the ones driving the bus aren't necessarily the human power brokers, because behind the human power brokers, there's a more sinister intelligence that wants to destroy, that wants to enslave, that wants you to worship them. This is why the nations, both in Psalm 82, Revelation, and lots of other passages. There's tons of passages like this in the Old Testament. This is why the nations are described this way and why the gods of those nations get looped into it. It's all one huge chaotic evil system that is aligned against, ultimately, the people of God. So, why, again, let's go back to the why question. This is what I think it's really about, because where's all this leading? Chapters 15, 16, 17, 18. Well, 19, we're going to get, we're going to get Armageddon. We're going to get the return of the Lord. We're going to get the day of the Lord, enacted. We're going to get all this evil. We're going to get the beast dealt with. Now think of it this way. If this is really about God against the nations, if this is really about the Psalm 82 judgment of the gods, the death of the gods finally coming to pass, think about the purpose of that. Think about the purpose of that. Revelation 17 is an integral part of the day of the Lord judgment of the gods and the reclaiming of the earth. Why? For the re-inheritance of the Messiah. The earth is going to be wiped clean of chaos. The earth is being readied again to be sacred space for the true God and the King. That is ultimately what this is about. The earth must be made fit. Okay? It must be made fit for the reoccupation of the true King in a new Eden with his own family and his reconstituted council going back to Eden, and that's us. So again, we need to pay attention to the theological backdrop behind all of these sorts of descriptions. It's not about who has the best weaponry. It's not about who has the best army. It's ultimately about the gods getting what they deserve, the beast getting what it deserves. It's about the annihilation of chaos. Chaos must be annihilated. It must be eliminated in totality. Because this time, when the Lord returns, chapter 19, okay, he's going to be occupying a new Eden. And in this case, the new Eden is global. The whole world, every nation, every square inch of the place has to be readied and retooled, refit to be sacred space because he is showing up. Okay, he is reoccupying. So again, we need to think a little bit bigger picture about these things. I know they look strange, they look disparate, they look like they're not related. They're all related. They all fit together. Again, if you can take the bird's eye view and look down and look where John is drawing all this stuff, and the key here is the Babylon. The key here is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And then the imagery makes sense, and the end game makes sense. The ultimate conflict, as the players are taking sides, they make sense. So we're going to end there, and in the next time again we're going to obviously get into chapter 19. We might get into 20. I don't know yet. But this is ultimately what it's about. It's about reoccupation. It's about making the world a new Eden. It's about making it fit for sacred space because the King is about ready to show up. And then everything comes full circle. Psalm 82 judgment, the death of the gods, the whole thing is going to come full circle.